The haunting of the Tower of London is, by the weight of nearly 1,000 years of history, one of the most storied sites of reported supernatural activity in the world, and the fortress that gives it its name stands today on the north bank of the River Thames, at the eastern edge of the city of London, exactly where it has stood since the close of 1066. That year, William the Conqueror had won England at the Battle of Hastings, and he spent the months that followed securing his hold on a country that had not asked to be conquered. London was the largest city in England, and controlling it meant controlling the kingdom. The fortress he founded on the bank of the Thames was not built to be welcoming. It was built to be seen, to be feared, and to endure. It has done all three. The structure that would become known as the Tower of London began as a timber fortification, raised within the corner of the old Roman walls, using those ancient stones as ready-made defences, with the river guarding its southern face. Within a few years, stone replaced timber, and William set Gundulf, Bishop of Rochester, to oversee the construction of what would become the White Tower, a great keep of Kentish ragstone and Caen stone imported from northern France. The exact date that building began is uncertain, though it is generally placed around 1078. What rose from that ground was not merely a fortress. It was, across the centuries that followed, a royal palace, an armoury, a treasury, a mint, a menagerie, and the home of the crown jewels of England. It was also, in its long Middle Age, a prison, the names of those confined within its walls read as a chronicle of English power and its consequences. Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, was held and executed there. Henry VI, deposed king and prisoner, died within its walls, murdered, some say, though others hold it was heartbreak that killed him. The young princes, Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York, were housed there in 1483 and were never seen in public again. Lady Jane Grey spent her final days within the tower before her execution on Tower Green on the 12th of February, 1554. The reputation the tower carries of torture and death and prolonged suffering was shaped in part by writers of the 16th and 19th centuries who drew on its real history but also embellished it. Executions within the walls themselves were, by the measure of the tower's long history, relatively rare. The figures vary by source. One holds that only 7 people were executed within the tower before the world wars of the 20th century, while another places the total number of recorded executions inside its walls at 22. Another places the total number of recorded executions inside the tower's walls at 22. The two figures may count different things, and neither source resolves the discrepancy. What both agree on is that the tower's reputation for death exceeds, in volume at least, the documented record. And yet, the tradition of haunting at this place is old and persistent and does not depend on inflated numbers to sustain itself. It rests instead on specific figures, specific locations, and specific accounts, some of them detailed and some of them strange, accumulated over many generations. The ghost of Anne Boleyn is said to walk near the White Tower and to haunt the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, where her body was buried after her execution in 1536. She is described, across multiple accounts, as the spirit most often reported by visitors to the tower. In January of 1816, a sentry on guard outside the jewel house reported seeing an apparition of a bear advancing toward him and was said to have died of fright a few days later. In October of 1817, the keeper of the crown jewels himself reported a glowing, tubular form hovering in the jewel house. They will be told slowly and without exaggeration in the manner of history rather than theatre. The tower has never needed theatre. For now, it is enough to know that the fortress is there, as it has been for nearly 1,000 years, beside the Thames in the dark. The ravens that are kept within its walls, at least 6 at all times, according to the belief that the kingdom will fall if they are absent, are settled for the night. The yeoman warders have completed the ceremony of the keys, as they do each day without exception. The gates are closed. What moves within, if anything moves within, has been moving for a very long time.
The White Tower stands at the centre of everything that will follow in this series, and so it is worth pausing at the beginning to understand what it is made of and why it was built, and what it meant to the people who first saw it rise above the river. William the Conqueror had taken England in October of 1066 at the Battle of Hastings, and spent the remainder of that year moving through a conquered country, securing his position. London was the largest city in England, and it did not fall easily or willingly. William did not march directly on it. He took a circuitous route, ravaging the surrounding lands, cutting the city's supply lines, until in December of 1066 its leaders yielded without a direct assault. The fortress he then founded was not, in those first weeks, a structure of stone. It was timber and earthwork, raised within the angle formed by the old Roman walls on the eastern edge of the city, using those ancient fortifications as pre-built defences, with the river Thames providing additional protection along its southern face. The choice of position was not accidental. The tower's strongest and most impressive defences, when they came to be built in stone, overlooked what had been Saxon London. The fortress was designed to be seen by the people it was meant to overawe. It would have dominated the surrounding landscape and stood out clearly to anyone travelling on the river. William understood that conquest is not completed at the battlefield. It must be made visible daily in stone. Construction of the great stone keep that would give the entire castle its name is generally considered to have begun around 1078, though the exact date is uncertain. William entrusted oversight of the work to Gundulf, the Bishop of Rochester. Gundulf was not simply a churchman pressed into administrative service. He was a builder of considerable experience and reputation, and the structure he oversaw was from its conception intended to be something beyond an ordinary fortress. It was to be, simultaneously, a stronghold, a palace, and a statement of permanent authority. It may not have been fully completed until after William's own death in 1087, though by the latest reckoning it was almost certainly finished by 1100, when a bishop named Ranulf Flambard became the first recorded prisoner held within its walls, and shortly thereafter the first person to escape from them. The materials from which the White Tower was built were chosen with both practicality and intention. The main building material was Kentish ragstone, a hard and durable sedimentary rock quarried in the county to the southeast. For the facing details, the finer and more workable stone used to give the building its dressed exterior, Caen stone, was brought from northern France. The importing of stone from Normandy was itself a statement. It tied the new English fortress, visually and materially, to the culture of its builders. Reigate stone was also used, particularly in the lower courses of the building, and at levels corresponding to a break in construction, suggesting it was drawn upon when access to the Caen stone was limited. In later centuries, much of the original Caen stone facing was replaced with Portland stone, a harder and more weather-resistant material, during works carried out in the 17th and 18th centuries. What visitors see today is, in its outward surface, partly the product of those later interventions, though the mass and form of the structure beneath remain the work of the 11th century. The White Tower, not counting its projecting corner towers, measures approximately 36 by 32 metres at its base and rises to around 27 metres at the southern battlements. The building was originally arranged over 3 stories, with a basement below, an entrance level above that, and an upper floor. The entrance, as was the Norman custom for keeps of this kind, was set above ground level, accessed by a wooden staircase that could be removed if an attack came. The basement was an undercroft used for storage. The entrance floor was likely intended for the use of the constable of the tower and other senior officials. The upper floor contained a great hall and a residential chamber, and, in the southeast corner, a chapel. That chapel, known as St. John's Chapel, is among the oldest surviving Norman ecclesiastical interiors in England. It occupies the southeast corner of the upper floor and continues into the apse that projects from the building's exterior. Its current appearance, plain and unadorned, reflects something of how it would have looked in the Norman period, though in the 13th century, during the reign of Henry III, it was decorated with painted ornament and stained glass. The bare stone it presents to visitors today carries a particular quality of quietness, the quietness of a space that has been used for prayer across 9 centuries, in circumstances that ranged from royal ceremony to individual confinement. The tower was terraced into a slight mound, so that the northern face of the basement sits partly below ground level. The basement is lit through narrow slits in the walls. One of its rooms contained a well. The lowest spaces of the White Tower have, in later centuries, accumulated the most persistent associations with suffering and dread, and yet the fact sheet that guides this series is clear on one point. The Tower of London never had a permanent torture chamber. What the basement of the White Tower housed in later periods was a rack, a device introduced to England in 1447. Its presence was occasional and sanctioned case by case, not institutional. The image of the tower as a place of perpetual subterranean horror was substantially the invention of 16th century religious propagandists and 19th century writers working in the Gothic tradition. William the Conqueror founded the castle toward the end of 1066. He established across the whole of his reign 36 castles in England, with many more founded by his subordinates. The Norman programme of building has been described as the most extensive and concentrated programme of castle construction in the whole history of feudal Europe. These structures were not only military installations, they were centres of administration and residences of power. The Tower of London was, from the beginning, the most significant of them all, placed in the heart of the kingdom's largest city, beside its most important river. The river itself is part of the structure's meaning. The Thames was, for most of the tower's active history, the principal artery of London. Goods, people, messages, and prisoners arrived and departed by water. The south face of the castle looked directly onto the river, and the river looked back. The water gate that became known as Traitor's Gate, built between 1275 and 1279 by Edward I, formalised what the river had always been in relation to the tower, an entry point, a boundary, a place of passage that was sometimes final. The Norman castle that William founded was built in several phases. What he established in timber in late 1066 was reinforced and expanded under subsequent kings. The inner ward, the ring of fortification that encircles the White Tower to the north, east, and west, was created during the reign of Richard I, when a moat was dug to the west, and the castle's effective size was doubled. Henry III and Edward I between them reshaped the castle into something close to its present form, with successive curtain walls, towers studding the perimeter, and a new outer enclosure that surrounded the whole. Edward I's rebuilding programme, carried out between 1275 and 1285, cost approximately £21,000, more than double the total spent by Henry III across his entire reign. By 1285, the general layout of the Tower of London was, in its essentials, as it remains today. Among the structures incorporated into the castle during the expansions of the 13th century was the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, a Norman chapel that had previously stood outside the tower's walls. Henry III's enlargement of the castle brought it within the new perimeter. It was later rebuilt by Edward I at a cost of over £300, and rebuilt again by Henry VIII in 1519. The building that stands today dates from that Tudor reconstruction, though it was refurbished in the 19th century. It is within this chapel that Anne Boleyn was buried after her execution in 1536, and her presence there is central to the haunting traditions that will occupy later chapters of this series. The Wakefield Tower, whose construction began around 1220, stood at the corner of the innermost ward's wall along the river and probably served as a private residence for the king. It is the tower most closely associated in the haunting tradition with the ghost of Henry VI, who is said to be seen there as midnight approaches on the anniversary of his death. The Jewel House, in later centuries, the location of two of the most detailed and specific apparition accounts in the tower's recorded history, housed the crown jewels, treasures guarded with particular care from the reign of Henry III onward. It is worth holding these physical facts in mind as this series proceeds, because the haunting traditions of the Tower of London are, almost without exception, rooted in specific places within the structure. The ghost of Anne Boleyn is associated with the White Tower, with the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, and with the courtyard. The ghost of Henry VI is associated with the Wakefield Tower. The apparitions reported by the Sentry in January of 1816 and by the Keeper of the Crown Jewels in October of 1817 were both located in the Jewel House. The sounds associated with Guy Fawkes, who was brought to the tower on the 6th of November 1605 and tortured there until he signed a confession, are said to emanate from the area beneath the White Tower where he was most likely held. The geography of the haunting follows the geography of the building. This is perhaps what one would expect of a place where the stones themselves carry such a weight of specific, documented history. The tower was built to endure. The Kentish ragstone at its core is not a material that yields easily. The walls of the White Tower are at their base approximately 4.5 meters thick. The structure has stood through fire and siege, through the Civil War, through 2 world wars that left bomb damage on its fabric. It has been repaired and restored and partially rebuilt across the centuries, and it is still there. What is built to last has time to accumulate its histories. The tower has had nearly 1,000 years of them. The stories of those who suffered within its walls and of those who are said to remain within them still are inseparable from the stone that holds the building up. They rise from it in the way that cold rises from old walls in winter, present and persistent and not easily explained away. The chapters that follow will move through those stories one at a time, attending to the specific witnesses, the specific dates, the specific places. The building will remain beneath all of it, as it has remained beneath everything that has happened here since December of 1066, when a conquered city's leaders yielded to a Norman duke beside this river, and the first timber stakes were driven into the ground. The Tower of London was not built as a prison. This is a fact worth holding at the beginning of any account of its haunting tradition, because the reputation that has attached itself most firmly to the building, the reputation for confinement and suffering and death, came later and came gradually and was shaped as much by writers and propagandists as by the events themselves. Before it was a place of dread, the tower was a palace. Before it was a palace in the full sense, it was a fortress. And before it settled into any single identity, it accumulated functions the way a river accumulates silt, layer upon layer, each one pressing down upon what came before. The building's earliest role was that of a royal residence and administrative centre. In the years immediately following the conquest, the tower served as a base of operations for a new ruling power, establishing itself in a city that had not welcomed it. The White Tower itself, begun around 1078 under William the Conqueror and overseen by Gundulf, Bishop of Rochester, was designed from the outset as both a stronghold and a space of lordly accommodation. It has been described as the most complete 11th century palace in Europe. The upper floor contained a great hall in the west, a residential chamber in the east, and the chapel of St. John in the southeast corner, a space intended for the spiritual life of whoever occupied the building at any given time. This was not a dungeon. It was, in the terms of its age, a place of considerable comfort and status. The tradition of the monarch residing at the tower before a coronation was established early and persisted for centuries, from at least the early 14th century and continuing until the reign of Charles II in 1661. The monarch would prepare for their coronation by staying at the tower and lead a procession from there to Westminster Abbey. The last monarch to observe this custom was Charles II himself, though the state of the castle's accommodation by that point was so poor that he did not spend the night before his coronation within its walls. The tradition ended not with any deliberate abolition, but with the quiet acknowledgement that the building had ceased to function as a comfortable royal home. Henry III, whose reign spanned most of the 13th century, held court at the Tower on numerous occasions and held Parliament there at least twice. He was also an aesthete who wished to make the castle beautiful as well as formidable. Under his reign, the palace buildings of the innermost ward were renovated and elaborated, becoming comparable in comfort and ornament with other palatial residences of the period. The Queen's chamber was whitewashed and painted with flowers and imitation stonework. The chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, which Henry's enlargement of the castle had brought within the tower's new perimeter, was decorated with glazed windows and stalls for the King and Queen. These were the appointments of a place intended to be lived in, to be enjoyed, to express the dignity of those who inhabited it. Yet even during these years of palatial use, the tower was already accumulating other identities. It was an armory from early in its history, a place where the weapons and equipment of the kingdom were stored and organized. The Office of Ordnance and the Armory Office, predecessors of the Board of Ordnance, were resident at the tower from at least 1454. The Board of Ordnance eventually had its headquarters in the White Tower itself, using the surrounding buildings for storage. Alongside the storage of weapons, the tower housed the administrative machinery of military supply, the procurement of equipment, the appointment of craftsmen, the maintenance of readiness for war. The royal bowmaker, responsible for manufacturing longbows, crossbows, and other weapons, had a workshop in the Bowyer Tower. These functions did not replace the tower's palatial role so much as accumulate beside it, giving the building a complexity of purpose that no single description could easily capture. The treasury was another of the tower's long-held identities. The tradition of housing the crown jewels within its walls probably dates from the reign of Henry III. The jewel house was built specifically to house the royal regalia, including jewels, plate, and the symbols of sovereign power, such as the crown, the scepter, and the sword of state. The treasure was guarded with particular care, and a dedicated position was created for its keeper, a role that in the reign of Edward III paid 12 pence a day, a significant sum for the period. The crown jewels have been on public display since 1669, when they were moved to the Martin Tower after the jewel house was demolished. They have drawn visitors ever since, and it is around the jewel house in its various locations and configurations over the centuries that two of the most detailed apparition accounts in the tower's history would later be recorded. The Royal Mint occupied the tower for several centuries, beginning at least from the reign of Edward I, who moved it into the outer ward. By 1279, Edward had unified the country's numerous regional mints under a single centralized system, with the tower at its core. By 1560, the mint was located in a building in the outer ward near the Salt Tower. It remained within the castle for centuries, producing the coinage of successive monarchs until the latter half of the 19th century, when institutions that had inhabited the castle for generations gradually moved to other locations. The mint's departure left buildings empty, and it was partly this emptying out that allowed the Victorian programme of restoration to proceed. Among the tower's most unusual functions was its role as a menagerie, one of the earliest in England. There is evidence that King John kept wild animals at the tower, with records of payments to lion keepers surviving from 1210 to 1212. The royal menagerie is more extensively documented from the reign of Henry III. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II presented Henry with 3 leopards around 1235. In 1252, the sheriffs were ordered to contribute to the upkeep of the king's polar bear, a gift from Haakon IV of Norway, which reportedly went fishing in the Thames while tethered by a chain. In 1254 or 1255, Henry III received an African elephant from Louis IX of France, and a wooden structure measuring approximately 12 meters by 6 meters was constructed to house it. The elephant died in 1258, possibly because it was given red wine. Edward I added a lion and a lynx and appointed the first official keeper of the animals in 1288. Over subsequent reigns, the collection grew to include lions, leopards, wildcats, jackals, hyenas, bears, eagles, owls, and various types of monkeys. A semicircular structure known as the Lion Tower to the immediate west of the Middle Tower served as the animal's primary enclosure, and by the 1500s the area was simply called the menagerie. By the 18th century, the menagerie was open to the public, with admission costing 3 halfpence, or alternatively a cat or a dog to be fed to the lions. By the end of that century, the price had risen to 9 pence. In 1828, under the new keeper Alfred Copps, the collection grew to over 280 animals representing at least 60 species. 2 years later, following the death of George IV, the Duke of Wellington ordered the menagerie to be closed. Most of the animals were moved to the London Zoo in 1831, and the last of them left in 1835. The menagerie buildings were removed in 1852, though the Lion Tower itself was not demolished until 1853, following the death of Copps, who had been entitled to use it as a residence for the remainder of his life. In 1999, physical evidence of lion cages was found within the tower precinct, some as small as 2 meters by 3 meters for animals that could grow to over 2.5 meters in length. In 2008, the skulls of 2 male Barbary lions were found in the moat area, radiocarbon dated to between 1280 and 1385 and between 1420 and 1480. It is worth pausing on the menagerie, not only because it is one of the more unexpected chapters in the tower's history, but because it is relevant to at least one of the apparition accounts that will be examined in a later chapter of this series. In January of 1816, a sentry on guard outside the jewel house reported an apparition of a bear advancing toward him, and was reported to have died of fright a few days later. The Royal Menagerie was still present at the tower in 1816, still housing bears and other large animals. Whether the sentry's experience had any connection to the proximity of real animals, or whether the reported apparition drew its form from familiarity with those animals, is a question the sources do not answer. The account stands on its own terms and will be considered in full in a later chapter. The tower's function as a public record office is another of its less celebrated identities. Documents of state, legal records, and administrative materials were housed within its walls across several centuries, adding yet another layer
to its accumulating complexity of purpose. The tower was also, at various points in its history, the site of the Royal Observatory before that function moved elsewhere. What these various functions have in common is that they all required the tower to be operational, inhabited, maintained, and staffed. The building was never simply a monument or a ruin in waiting. It was a working institution, continuously occupied, continuously generating records and events and the kind of accumulated human presence that later centuries would try to account for in the language of haunting. The tower's use as a prison, the role for which it is now most widely remembered, was not its original purpose and was not, for most of its history, its primary one. As a royal castle, it was used by the monarch to hold individuals for various reasons, generally high-status individuals for relatively short periods. There were no purpose-built prisoner accommodations until 1687, when a structure described as a prison for soldiers was built to the northwest of the White Tower. Before that date, prisoners were held in whatever spaces were available, often in conditions that varied considerably depending on the status and resources of the individual concerned. High-status prisoners could purchase amenities, improve their lodgings, and in some cases accommodate their families within the tower's walls. The zenith of the castle's use as a prison came in the 16th and 17th centuries, when many who had fallen into political or religious disgrace were held within its walls. The number of executions carried out within the tower itself is a matter on which the sources do not agree, and this series preserves that disagreement rather than resolving it. Accounts differ on the true toll. One holds that only 7 people were executed within the tower on Tower Green before the world wars of the 20th century, while another puts the total number of recorded executions inside the walls at 22. Either way, executions were far more commonly carried out on Tower Hill to the north of the castle. According to another account, 22 recorded executions have taken place inside the tower's walls across its history. The two figures may reflect different ways of counting. Tower Green, executions only, or all executions at the tower in any location. Both figures are given as stated by their respective sources, and neither is presented here as definitive. What is not disputed is that the tower was the site of notable individual executions that left enduring marks on the building's historical identity. Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, was executed in the courtyard on the 19th of May, 1536, having been convicted of treason. She was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower. Lady Jane Grey was executed on Tower Green on the 12th of February 1554. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was also executed at the tower. These are among the individuals whose names appear repeatedly in the tower's haunting tradition. The tower's reputation as a place of torture and death, which became so fixed in the public imagination during the 19th century, was shaped in large part by writers rather than by the historical record alone. In the 16th century, the building's image as a grim fortress was propagated by religious writers with particular purposes. In the 19th century, novelists and popular historians elaborated these associations into something approaching mythology. The writer William Harrison Ainsworth was particularly influential in this process. His novel set in and around the tower created a vivid image of underground torture chambers and confession-extracting devices that lodged itself in the popular imagination, though this image was not supported by the historical record. Ainsworth also played a more directly practical role in the tower's Victorian history. He suggested that Beauchamp Tower be opened to the public so that visitors could see the inscriptions carved by 16th and 17th century prisoners, and this suggestion was acted upon. The Gothic imagination and the historical institution became, during this period, mutually reinforcing. The tower has been a tourist attraction since at least the Elizabethan period, when it was already among the sights of London that foreign visitors wrote about. Its most popular early attractions were the royal menagerie and the displays of armour. By 1851, visitor numbers had grown so large that a purpose-built ticket office was erected, and by the end of the 19th century, more than 500,000 people were visiting the castle each year. Today, the Tower of London is described as the country's 9th most popular tourist attraction, recording nearly 2,800,000 visitors in 2025. Since 1990, it has been cared for by Historic Royal Palaces, an independent charity that receives no government or Crown funding. It was added to the UNESCO list of World Heritage Sites in 1988 in recognition of its global importance. The tower's transition from active institution to historical site did not happen all at once. The Royal Mint moved out in the 19th century. The menagerie had gone by 1835. The armoury and ordnance functions wound down across the latter half of the 19th century and into the 20th. In the First and Second World Wars, the tower was briefly returned to something like its old functions, used once again as a prison and the site of executions, 12 men having been shot for espionage during the First World War, and further executions carried out during the Second. The last state prisoner to be held at the tower was Rudolf Hess, held there for 4 days in 1941. The last person to be executed at the tower was Joseph Jacobs, a German spy, shot on the 15th of August 1941. After the Second World War, the bomb damage of the Blitz was repaired and the castle was reopened to the public. What this accumulation of functions means, for the purposes of this series, is that the Tower of London is not simply a building with a dark reputation attached to it from outside. The darkness, such as it is structural. It is built into the history of the place in the same way that the ragstone is built into its walls. The tower was the site of real imprisonment, real torture conducted under Privy Council sanction in the most intense years of the 16th and 17th centuries, and real execution. It was also a palace, a treasury, a mint, a zoo, a record office, and an armoury. It was all of these things at once, and across nearly 1,000 years of continuous occupation. The density of human event that took place within its walls is, by any measure, extraordinary. It is this density, perhaps more than any single dramatic occurrence, that gives the tower its peculiar quality. Places accumulate their histories in the way that old stone accumulates moisture. Gradually, invisibly, until the surface is saturated. The haunting traditions of the Tower of London do not attach themselves to the building arbitrarily. They attach themselves to specific rooms, specific towers, specific corridors and courtyards where specific things are known to have happened to specific people. The geography of the reported haunting is, as was noted in the previous chapter, inseparable from the geography of the documented history. The chapters that follow will attend to that geography one encounter at a time. Each of the major figures associated with the tower's haunting tradition had a life within these walls before they became part of the tradition. Anne Boleyn arrived at the tower in happiness in the days before her coronation and returned to it against her will less than 3 years later. Henry VI was held in the tower during the turbulent years of the Wars of the Roses and died there, whether by murder or by the kind of despair that the sources describe as heartbreak without ever leaving,
Guy Fawkes was brought to the Tower on the 6th of November 1605 and subjected to torture until he provided a confession. The princes in the Tower, Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, were housed at the castle in 1483 and were never seen in public again. These are the figures, the stones are the setting, the long accumulation of the Tower's many lives, from Norman fortress to royal residence, from armoury to mint, from menagerie to prison to the most visited historic site in England, is the context within which everything that follows must be understood. A building this old, this continuously inhabited, this deeply embedded in the political and personal crises of a nation across 9 centuries, does not shed its histories easily. It holds them as it was built to hold everything that came within its walls.
A reputation written in blood. The Tower of London stands on the north bank of the River Thames, at the eastern edge of what was once the walled Roman settlement that became the City of London. It was founded toward the end of 1066 as part of the Norman conquest of England, and its oldest surviving structure, the White Tower, was begun, according to most accounts, in 1078, though the exact date remains uncertain. William the Conqueror ordered its construction and made Gundulf, Bishop of Rochester, responsible for overseeing the work. The building that rose from that commission was described in later centuries as the most complete 11th century palace in Europe, and for a long time it served precisely that purpose, as a residence, a treasury, a symbol of legitimate authority settled into stone. That original purpose is worth holding in mind, because the Tower's reputation today is of a very different character. In the popular imagination, it is a place of suffering, of confinement, of judicial violence carried out in shadow. That reputation is not without foundation, but it is also not quite what the record shows. The distance between what the Tower was and what people believe it to have been is itself a kind of haunting, a story told and retold until the telling became more vivid than the truth beneath it. Understanding that distance is the first task of any serious account of the Tower's darker history. The sources are plain on one point that often surprises those who encounter it for the first time. Despite its enduring reputation as a place of systematic torture and mass execution, the Tower of London never had a permanent torture chamber. The basement of the White Tower did, at certain periods, house a rack, but this was not a dedicated facility maintained continuously for that purpose. Torture, when it occurred at the Tower, required the sanction of the Privy Council before it could be applied, which meant that its use was relatively infrequent and bureaucratically governed rather than casual or routine. Between 1540 and 1640, the period that represents the peak of the Tower's use as a prison, the recorded cases of torture number 48. That figure covers a full century of operation during the most politically turbulent era in the building's history. It is not a small number, and the suffering it represents was real and serious, but it is far from the picture of perpetual underground agony that popular culture has long preferred. The 3 forms of torture most commonly employed were the rack, the scavenger's daughter, and manacles. The rack itself was introduced to England in 1447 by the Duke of Exeter, who held the position of Constable of the Tower, and it acquired, partly as a dark jest, the name the Duke of Exeter's daughter. Among those subjected to it was Guy Fawkes, the gunpowder plot conspirator who was brought to the Tower on the 6th of November 1605, and who, after torture, signed a full confession. Joe Rowan, writing for the Sky History Channel in 2020, describes Fawkes as having been imprisoned following his failed attempt to assassinate James I at Parliament, and subjected to intense torture to compel him to give up his co-conspirators. Rowan locates this ordeal most likely in the dungeons beneath the White Tower, though this specific detail carries some uncertainty. The ghost said to linger in that part of the building is, accordingly, identified not as a visible apparition, but as an auditory one. Rowan describes claims that some have heard cries of anguish and pleas for mercy long after Fawkes' execution, sounds associated with the area beneath the White Tower where the torture most likely took place. It is a particular quality of this haunting that Fawkes is said to be present, not as a figure to be seen, but as a suffering to be heard, and there is something fitting in that distinction. The historical record preserves his signed confession, a document produced under extreme duress, and the folklore preserves his cries as though the tower itself has retained the acoustics of that coercion. The question of how many people were executed within the tower's walls is one on which the sources do not agree, and the disagreement is significant enough to require careful handling. The Wikipedia entry on the Tower of London states that only 7 people were executed within the tower itself before the world wars of the 20th century, specifying that these took place on Tower Green and were reserved for those prisoners for whom a public execution was considered too dangerous. The far more common practice was to carry out executions on Tower Hill, to the north of the castle, where 112 people were put to death over a period of 400 years. Joe Rowan, by contrast, places the number of recorded executions inside the tower's walls at 22. The two figures may be counting different things, perhaps different definitions of what constitutes the tower's interior, or different categories of execution across different periods, but the sources do not resolve this, and the contradiction is best left standing as a genuine uncertainty in the record. Both figures agree, however, that public execution was conducted predominantly outside the walls, on Tower Hill, and that the executions carried out within the tower were comparatively few and frequently connected to individuals whose public deaths might have provoked unrest. Among those executed on Tower Green was Lady Jane Grey, put to death on the 12th of February 1554. Her execution followed a period of confinement within the tower, and the Wikipedia source notes that the same pattern of internal execution being used for politically sensitive prisoners applied in her case. Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, was also executed within the tower, in the courtyard, on the 19th of May 1536, having been convicted of treason against the king, and Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, is recorded among those executed at the tower and is also counted among the figures said to haunt it. The tower's reputation as a place of torture and death was not, the sources make clear, simply a natural consequence of events. It was, to a considerable degree, a constructed reputation, one shaped by particular historical forces at particular moments. The Wikipedia entry on the tower identifies 2 groups principally responsible for the image that endures today: 16th century religious propagandists and 19th century writers. The Reformation and its aftermath created a climate in which the tower's association with the imprisonment and execution of religious figures could be wielded polemically. The building recast as an instrument of persecution rather than a royal residence and administrative centre that occasionally served as a prison for high-status individuals. The 19th century then added its own layer, the Gothic imagination finding in the tower a ready symbol of feudal darkness, underground chambers, and sovereign cruelty. The work of William Harrison Ainsworth was particularly influential in the latter process. His historical romance set at the tower created, according to the Wikipedia source, a vivid image of underground torture chambers and devices for extracting confessions that lodged itself in the public imagination. It was a fictional vision that many subsequent readers took for documentary record, and its effects on how the tower is perceived have proven remarkably durable. By the end of the 19th century, more than 500,000 people were visiting the tower each year, and many of them arrived already furnished with Ainsworth's imagery, expecting a dungeon that the historical record does not fully support. This is not to say that the tower's history is without genuine darkness. The record is clear that the 16th and 17th centuries represented the peak of its use as a prison, a period when many religious and political figures were confined within its walls. The zenith of that use stretched across the reigns of the Tudor and early Stuart monarchs, when those who had fallen into disgrace, and those whose religious convictions placed them at odds with the state, found themselves sent to the tower. The phrase itself, to be sent to the tower, became a recognized shorthand for political disgrace, and the beginning of a process that might end in execution, though it did not always do so. Some prisoners lived in conditions comparable to those they might have expected outside, purchasing better food and domestic comforts, keeping servants, and receiving visitors. Others endured far harsher treatment. The tower was not a single experience, but a range of them, shaped by the status, resources, and political circumstances of the individual confined within it. The princes in the tower stand as perhaps the most enduring mystery in the building's long history of confinement. In 1483, the boy King Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, were housed at the tower, while their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was declared Lord Protector. The two boys were last seen in public in June of that year. It has traditionally been held that they were most likely murdered in the late summer of 1483, though the precise circumstances of their disappearance have never been established. Bones believed to belong to them were discovered in 1674 during the demolition of a fore-building at the entrance to the White Tower, though subsequent analysis has raised questions about whether the bones were indeed the prince's remains. The case remains open, the mystery intact, and the boys are counted among the figures said to haunt the building where they vanished. Henry VI presents a different kind of uncertainty. He was held at the Tower during the Wars of the Roses and died there, but the manner of his death is a matter on which the sources diverge. Sources disagree on how Henry VI died in the Tower. Some say he was probably murdered, while others hold that heartbreak over losing his crown and his heir simply hastened his end. Joe Rowan presents the question more openly, noting that some accounts hold he died of heartbreak and melancholy after losing both his crown and his heir, while others maintain that he was murdered by Edward IV in order to clear his path to the throne. Neither position has been definitively established, and the historical record does not resolve it. What the sources agree on is that Henry died in the Tower, and that his ghost is said to pace the Wakefield Tower and the chapel as midnight approaches on the anniversary of his death, as though replaying the circumstances of that final night. The Wakefield Tower has its own place in this history. Construction of both the Wakefield and Lanthorn Towers began around 1220, and the Wakefield Tower probably served at one time as a private residence for the king. It is now associated, in the folklore of the building, with Henry VI, and the chapel to which his ghost is said to move is the Church of St. Peter ad Vincula, the Norman chapel that was incorporated into the tower's inner ward during the reign of Henry III. That church is also the burial place of Anne Boleyn, whose remains were interred there following her execution in 1536. It is a small, severe building that has served, over the centuries, as the final resting place of a number of those executed at the Tower, and its role in the haunting tradition of the site reflects its proximity to the most violent episodes in the building's history. The account of Anne Boleyn's ghost is the one most frequently reported by visitors to the Tower, according to both the Wikipedia source and Rowan. She is said to walk near the White Tower carrying her head beneath her arm, and to haunt the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula where she is buried, and to be seen moving through the courtyard. Rowan observes that Anne's first stay at the Tower was a happy one, in the days immediately before her coronation as Queen, when she and Henry VIII occupied the royal apartments and she was celebrated with gifts and ceremony. Less than 1,000 days later, she returned to those same apartments as a prisoner and was executed in the courtyard. The Wikipedia source notes that this haunting was sufficiently well established in popular culture by 1934 to be commemorated in a comic song, the only ghost of the Tower to have acquired that particular form of recognition. The materials used to construct the White Tower itself are worth noting in this context, because they tell something about the nature of the building that has accumulated so many stories. The main building material is Kentish ragstone, with cane stone imported from northern France for facing details, and ragate stone used for carved elements. Much of the original Caen stone was replaced with Portland stone in the 17th and 18th centuries, and the building has been altered, repaired, and modified across nearly 1,000 years. It is not a static object. It is a structure that has been continuously reworked, each generation adapting it to new purposes, new inhabitants, new needs. The stone that stands today is not entirely the stone that was laid in 1078, and the building that visitors enter is not entirely the building that housed the princes or Fawkes or Anne Boleyn, and yet the Tower's reputation has a kind of permanence that the building's physical fabric does not. The propagandists and the novelists did their work too well, or perhaps the events themselves were compelling enough that no amount of revision could dislodge them from public memory. The record is more complex, more qualified, and in some respects more ordinary than the legend allows. The Tower was a castle that served many purposes, most of them administrative and ceremonial. Its use as a prison was real, but historically bounded, concentrated in particular centuries, and reserved, for the most part, for high-status individuals, rather than the general population. Its use as a place of execution was real, but numerically modest compared to the execution ground on Tower Hill that stood just outside its walls. Its use as a place of torture was real, but governed by formal procedure and far less frequent than the image of underground chambers and perpetual suffering suggests. What the record cannot explain, and does not attempt to explain, is the persistence of the reports. Night staff at the tower, in more recent times, have described nameless and formless apparitions that the sources do not attach to any specific historical figure. The sentry who stood guard outside the jewel house in January 1816 reported an apparition of a bear advancing toward him, and was said to have died of fright a few days later, in an account that the sources record without either endorsing or dismissing. Edmund Lenthal Swifte, the keeper of the crown jewels, reported in October 1817 a glowing tubular shape that he said hovered over his wife's shoulder in the jewel house, and which she cried out had seized her. These accounts will be examined in closer detail in the chapters that follow. For now, it is enough to observe that they belong to a building whose reputation was shaped partly by events and partly by the stories told about those events, and that the two things, the history and the haunting, have become so thoroughly entwined that separating them requires care. The Tower is officially His Majesty's Royal Palace and Fortress of the Tower of London, a designation that gestures toward its origins as a residence and a seat of authority. It is also, in the imagination of the millions who visit it each year, something else entirely, a place where the dead have not entirely departed, and where the walls hold more than stone.
The Tower of London stands on the north bank of the River Thames, at the eastern edge of the City of London, in the borough of Tower Hamlets. It was founded toward the end of 1066 as part of the Norman conquest by William the Conqueror. The White Tower, which gives the whole castle its name, was begun in 1078, though the exact date is uncertain, and its construction was overseen by Gundulf, Bishop of Rochester. The principal building material was Kentish ragstone, with Caen stone imported from northern France for facing details, Reigate stone used for carved work, and Portland stone introduced in later centuries as a replacement. From its earliest days, the castle served many purposes: a royal residence, an armoury, a treasury, a place of record, and in time, a prison. It is this last identity that has settled most deeply into the imagination of the centuries that followed. Of all the figures who passed through the tower's gates and did not leave in the way they had hoped, one name returns more persistently than any other. She is described as the spirit most often reported by visitors to the tower. She is Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, Queen Consort, convicted of treason and executed within the tower's walls on the 19th of May, 1536. To understand the weight of that death, it is necessary to begin at a different moment, one of ceremony and happiness rather than imprisonment and grief. Anne Boleyn's first arrival at the Tower was not as a prisoner, it was as a queen. In the days leading up to her coronation, Anne and Henry stayed in the royal apartments within the Tower itself. She was shown through those apartments, given gifts, and treated with the ceremony appropriate to her new station as the king's wife, and the woman who would, Henry believed, provide him with the male heir England required. The Tower, in those days, still carried something of its older identity as a palace. For generations, the tradition had held that English monarchs would spend the nights before their coronation at the Tower, and lead a procession from there to Westminster Abbey. For Anne, that tradition was observed. She moved through its halls as a queen. The contrast with what followed is not merely dramatic, it is, by the measure of history, almost without parallel. Less than 3 years after that coronation, Anne was brought back to the Tower. She came this time not in procession and celebration, but as a prisoner held against her will, found guilty of treason against the king who had so recently elevated her. The charge of treason against Henry VIII was the legal mechanism by which Anne's fate was sealed. On the 19th of May, 1536, she was executed in the courtyard of the Tower. Her body was buried within the Tower itself, in the church of St. Peter ad Vincula, the small Norman chapel that had been incorporated into the castle's inner ward during an expansion under Henry III, and which was rebuilt to its present form under Henry VIII in 1519. It is worth pausing on the matter of executions within the tower's walls, because the popular imagination tends to picture the place as the site of numberless deaths, a fortress of perpetual execution. The historical record is considerably more restrained, and the sources do not entirely agree. According to one account, the true number of executions carried out within the tower's walls is itself a matter of some debate. Some accounts hold that only 7 people were put to death inside the fortress before the world wars of the 20th century, while others record as many as 22. What is clear is that the great majority of executions took place on Tower Hill to the north of the castle, where 112 deaths were recorded over a period of 400 years. A different account holds that 22 recorded executions in total have taken place inside the tower's walls. The two figures may count different things, and the sources do not reconcile them. What they agree upon is the relative rarity of death within the tower's own precincts, and the fact that those executed there were, almost without exception, figures for whom a public death on Tower Hill was considered too dangerous or too complicated to arrange. Lady Jane Grey's execution on the 12th of February 1554 is given as one such example. Anne Boleyn's belongs to the same category. The tower never had a permanent torture chamber, despite the enduring image of it as a place of systematic physical torment. The basement of the White Tower housed a rack in certain periods, and torture was used on specific prisoners with the sanction of the Privy Council, but it was not a routine or continuous feature of life within the castle. Between 1540 and 1640, the peak years of imprisonment at the Tower, 48 recorded cases of torture were documented. The Tower's reputation as a place of systematic horror owes more to the writing of 16th century religious propagandists and 19th century romanticists than to the historical record, as the sources are careful to note. But none of this diminishes what the Tower was and what it remained for Anne Boleyn. She had come to it twice. The first time she left as a queen preparing to be crowned. The second time she did not leave at all, or not entirely, or not in the way that living people leave a place. She was buried within its walls, in the chapel that still stands within the inner ward, and the stories that gathered around her name in the years and centuries that followed have never fully dispersed. The image most commonly associated with her ghost is striking in its specificity. Anne Boleyn is said to walk near the White Tower, and in some accounts to carry her head beneath her arm. The image is vivid enough that it entered popular culture in 1934 in a comic song whose title describes precisely that image, the figure with her head tucked underneath her arm. It is worth noting that the song belongs to the realm of popular culture rather than testimony, and that the tone of that particular work is far from solemn. The image it fixed in the wider imagination, however, has proved durable. More frequently cited in accounts of the Tower's hauntings is Anne's reported presence around the church of St. Peter ad Vincula, where she is buried. The chapel is a small, quiet building of Norman origin and Tudor reconstruction, and it holds within its floor the remains of several figures who died within the tower. That Anne's ghost is most associated with this place is perhaps the detail that carries the most weight in these accounts. It is the location of her burial, the place where what remained of her was laid. The reports that connect her to this chapel are reports of presence at a grave. She is also described as frequently appearing in the courtyard of the tower. The courtyard is where she was executed on the 19th of May, 1536. The two locations taken together, the chapel and the courtyard, map almost precisely onto the final chapter of her documented life, the site of her death and the site of her burial. Whether one finds this significant or merely coincidental will depend on what one brings to these accounts. The sources report the pattern without resolving it. Joe Rowan, writing in 2020, notes that Anne Boleyn's ghost is the spirit most often reported by visitors to the tower. Rowan also observes that Anne's presence in the tower spans two very different kinds of experience: the early happiness of the Queen-to-be in the royal apartments and the terror of her final days as a condemned prisoner. Both moments, Rowan suggests, are woven into the tradition of her haunting. Whether the figure that visitors report is understood to be reliving triumph or reliving dread, the accounts persist. The tower itself has been accumulating these kinds of accounts for a very long time. Its role as a prison reached its peak during the 16th and 17th centuries, a period when many figures who had fallen from favour or who held religious or political views incompatible with those in power found themselves within its walls. Among those held and executed at the tower was Anne Boleyn. Other figures whose names appear in the tower's catalogue of reported ghosts include Henry VI, Lady Jane Grey, Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, and the princes in the tower, the two boys who disappeared within its walls in 1483 and were presumed murdered. But Anne Boleyn is the figure who appears most often in the reports, and her name is the one that returns most consistently when the tower's reputation as a haunted place is discussed. There is something in the particular shape of her story that may account for this persistence. The contrast between her two arrivals at the tower is stark and by any measure terrible. The first arrival was one of the highest moments in her life, a prelude to a coronation surrounded by ceremony and the favour of a king. The second was an imprisonment that ended in execution. She came to the place that would become her grave at the height of her power, and she returned to it as a condemned woman. The chapel where she is buried is part of the same complex of buildings where she had stood years before, preparing to be crowned. That geographical compression, the fact that triumph and death and burial all occupy the same small area of ground, may be part of what gives the accounts of her haunting their particular quality. The church of St. Peter at Vincula, where Anne Boleyn is buried, is a building with its own quiet history. Originally a Norman chapel that stood outside the tower's walls, it was incorporated into the inner ward when Henry III expanded the castle in the 13th century. It was rebuilt by Edward I at a cost of more than £300 and rebuilt again under Henry VIII in 1519. The building that stands today dates from this last rebuilding, though it was refurbished in the 19th century. It is a small plain building, as such chapels within castle walls tend to be, and it holds within it the remains of people who died in circumstances that were, in most cases, far from ordinary. Anne Boleyn was beheaded in 1536 for treason against Henry VIII. Her ghost is reported at the church of St. Peter at Vincula, where she is buried and is said to walk near the White Tower, in some accounts carrying her head beneath her arm. She is also frequently reported in the courtyard. The accounts are consistent in their geography, even when they differ in their details. They return again and again to the same small area of ground. The execution itself was carried out on the 19th of May, 1536. It took place in the courtyard of the tower, the same open space where accounts of Anne's ghost most frequently place her. Her body was buried the same day within the chapel. The speed of burial, the absence of any elaborate ceremony, the proximity of the execution site and the grave, all of these are part of the documented record of that day. The reports of her haunting seem to follow the same geography with a fidelity that, whatever one makes of it, is consistent. The tower's reputation as a haunted place is old. It has been a tourist attraction since at least the Elizabethan period, one of the sights of London that foreign visitors wrote about in the centuries that followed its construction. Its most popular early attractions were the Royal Menagerie, which was housed within the castle for several centuries, and displays of armour. The crown jewels have been on public display since 1669. By the end of the 19th century, more than 500,000 people were visiting the castle every year. The tower's identity as a place of history and its identity as a place of haunting have grown alongside each other for a long time. Among the figures whose names appear in accounts of the tower's hauntings, Anne Boleyn is described as the most frequently reported. Other apparitions have been claimed within the tower's walls, among them the ghost of Henry VI, said to pace the Wakefield Tower and the chapel as midnight approaches on the anniversary of his death, and the figure of Lady Jane Grey, whose execution on Tower Green was itself unusual, reserved, as the sources note, for prisoners for whom a public execution was considered too dangerous. There are also reports of nameless and formless apparitions, described more recently by the tower's night staff, figures that carry no historical identity and no recorded story. These are the edges of the tower's haunted geography, the places where the accounts thin out and become harder to follow. Anne Boleyn belongs to the centre of that geography, to its most documented and most persistently reported tradition. The stories that surround her are not, in the main, violent or dramatic in the manner of their telling. They are stories of a figure walking, pacing, returning to the places that were last familiar to her. The courtyard where she died, the chapel where she was buried, the area around the White Tower, which had stood at the heart of the castle since the late 11th century, since before any of the figures whose names are now associated with the tower's hauntings had lived or died within its walls. There is a quietness to these accounts that is perhaps unexpected given the circumstances of the death they follow. Anne Boleyn was executed by the authority of the state on a charge that the historical record has not resolved to the satisfaction of later generations. She was the second wife of a king who would have 6 wives in total. She was queen for less than 3 years. She was buried within the walls of the castle where she was killed, in a chapel built and rebuilt by the very dynasty whose representative had ordered her death. The stories that gathered around her name after her death are, by any measure, appropriate to the scale of what had happened. And yet the accounts most commonly given are not of a vengeful or angry spirit. They are accounts of presence, of a figure seen in familiar places, of a queen who has not entirely left the rooms and grounds that were, in the fullness of her brief reign, her own. The courtyard and the chapel, the area near the White Tower, the places that were last known to her in the days that ended on the 19th of May, 1536. Whether these accounts represent something that occurred, something imagined, something shaped by the long reputation of a place and a person, or some combination of all three, is not a question the sources resolve. The tradition itself is old and consistent. Anne Boleyn is buried in the church of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the Tower of London, where she was executed in 1536. The reports of her presence in those same precincts have continued for a very long time. The tower stands, as it has stood since the close of 1066, on the north bank of the Thames, and the accounts of the Queen who walks within its walls have not, in all the centuries since her death, entirely ceased.
In Wakefield Tower, among the ghosts said to inhabit the Tower of London, one of the oldest in spirit and most sorrowful in legend, belongs to a king who had already lost almost everything before he arrived for the last time. Henry VI, whose reign spanned the most turbulent decades of the 15th century, is described in the sources as a man who knew the Tower not as an occasional royal residence, but as a place of confinement, a destination to which the tides of the Wars of the Roses returned him more than once. His ghost, as tradition tells it, is seen pacing the Wakefield Tower and the chapel as midnight approaches on the anniversary of his death, a figure cursed to keep vigil at the threshold of a fate that history has never fully settled. To understand why the legend takes the shape it does, it helps to begin not with the ghost, but with the king, and with the long, grinding process by which he came to be in the Tower at all. Henry VI was the son of Henry V, the victor of Agincourt, and he inherited the throne of England as an infant in 1422. A reign that began in the nursery was always likely to be difficult, and Henry's proved to be so in ways that went beyond the ordinary difficulties of minority rule. He grew into a man whose personal piety and gentleness were remarked upon, but whose grip on political power was fragile, and the second half of his reign saw England convulsed by the dynastic conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York that would later be named the Wars of the Roses. The Tower of London, always a barometer of political fortune in England, felt the pressure of those decades acutely. The castle had long served as both symbol and instrument of royal power. Founded by William the Conqueror toward the end of 1066, and expanded substantially by Henry III and Edward I in the 12th and 13th centuries, it sat on the north bank of the River Thames at the eastern edge of the City of London, its walls and towers visible to river traffic and to the population of the capital alike. Its Wakefield Tower, constructed beginning around 1220, had been intended in its earliest form as a private residence for the king himself, standing at a corner of the innermost ward along the river. By Henry VI's time, the uses to which such towers were put had shifted considerably, and what had been a royal apartment could as easily become a prison. Henry's connection to the tower deepened during the 1460s as Yorkist fortunes ascended. The castle was besieged in 1460 by a Yorkist force, and surrendered only when Henry VI was captured at the Battle of Northampton. For a time, with the help of Richard Neville, the 16th Earl of Warwick, Henry recovered his throne, recapturing it briefly in 1470. But the recovery was short-lived. Edward IV soon regained control, and Henry VI was imprisoned once more in the Tower of London. He had lost his son and heir at the Battle of Tewkesbury. He had lost his crown. And then, according to every source, he lost his life within the tower's walls. It is here that the historical record divides, and the division is genuine enough that neither version should be set aside in favour of the other. The Wikipedia account of the tower's history states plainly that Henry VI was imprisoned in the Tower of London, where he was probably murdered. It signals that the conclusion is the one most historians have found most plausible, while acknowledging that the evidence is circumstantial. There is no contemporary document that records the manner of his death with the precision one might wish for. What the sources agree upon is that he died in the Tower, that Edward IV was now securely in power, and that a living Lancastrian king posed an obvious threat to Yorkist stability. The account offered by Joe Rowan, writing in 2020, presents a more openly contested picture. Rowan notes that there is no record of the manner of Henry's death, and that opinions have historically divided along two lines. Some have held that it was heartbreak that hastened his end, the grief of a man who had lost both his crown and his heir, pressing upon him until his body gave way. Others have believed that the king was murdered by Edward IV in order to clear the path to the throne of any remaining Lancastrian claim. Rowan presents both positions without resolving them, which is an honest accounting of what the evidence permits. This uncertainty is not merely a modern scruple. It has persisted for centuries, and it matters for the legend that grew up around Henry's death, because the legend, too, is shaped by ambiguity. A figure who died of grief occupies a different kind of imaginative space than one who was killed by a rival's order. The ghost attributed to Henry VI carries both possibilities within it, and the tradition as recorded does not choose between them. What the tradition does specify is a quality of restlessness. Rowan describes the attributed legend in terms of a spirit that cannot rest, compelled to relive the circumstances of its death in an endless repetition. The figure said to haunt the Wakefield Tower is described as pacing, moving through the tower and the chapel as though awaiting something that has not yet arrived, and doing so as the clock approaches midnight on the anniversary of the death. The repetition at a fixed point in the calendar is a feature that recurs in many ghost traditions, and it lends the legend a quality that is more cyclical than dramatic, not a sudden apparition but a slow, regular return, as reliable in its way as the turning of the year. The Wakefield Tower itself has a particular resonance in this context. It stands at the corner of the innermost ward, and its history as a royal private residence, before the tower's uses shifted toward imprisonment and administration, gives it a layered character that the legend inhabits comfortably. A tower built as a king's lodging, later used to confine a king, later still the site of a reported royal ghost, carries its history in its stones in a way that is legible even without the supernatural element. The chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, which is included in the attributed haunting alongside the Wakefield Tower, was a Norman chapel that had stood outside the tower's walls before Henry III incorporated it into the castle. It had been rebuilt more than once, and by Henry VI's time it served as the chapel of the garrison and the burial place for those who died within the tower's precincts. For the ghost of a king to be associated with both a royal tower and a chapel is consistent with what the tower was, physically and spiritually, for the people who had lived and died within it. The Wars of the Roses gave the tower a concentration of royal and noble deaths, unusual even by the standards of a building that had always been close to the exercise of power. Henry VI was not the only figure of consequence to die there during those decades. The castle's role as a prison for high-status individuals meant that its walls witnessed the fate of people whose names history preserved and whose deaths left the kind of trace that legends require. The disappearance of the princes in the tower, Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, in 1483, is among the most notorious episodes associated with the castle. The deaths of the Wars of the Roses did not happen in isolation from each other. They accumulated, and the tower accumulated with them, a reputation that would only grow through the Tudor period. It is worth pausing on the physical character of the tower in order to understand the conditions in which the legend of Henry VI took root. The castle, by the 15th century, was a complex of several buildings set within two concentric rings of defensive walls, with a moat beyond them. The innermost ward, containing the White Tower and the older structures including the Wakefield Tower, was the earliest part of the complex, and the buildings in it had been through many alterations. The Wakefield Tower and the Lanthorn Tower, standing at the corners of the innermost ward's southern wall along the river, had been built beginning around 1220, probably to serve as private residences. Whatever comfort they might once have offered had long since been subordinated to the tower's more austere functions by the time Henry VI came to occupy them. The tower never had a permanent torture chamber, despite its reputation. That reputation was partly the product of 16th century religious propagandists and 19th century writers who found in the tower's history raw material for a particular kind of Gothic imagining. But the reality was grim enough without embellishment. The peak of the tower's use as a prison came in the 16th and 17th centuries, and the zenith of its association with political execution came somewhat later than Henry's time. What Henry's period contributed to the tower's accumulated character was something slightly different, the sense that the castle could absorb the deaths of kings, not merely the deaths of lesser figures whose executions served a political function, but the deaths of men who had themselves wielded sovereign power and lost it. The legend of Henry VI gained some of its weight from this context. The Wakefield Tower is not a dungeon or a place of execution. It is a tower that was built to house a king. The figure said to pace it on the anniversary of his death is therefore haunting a space that was, in some historical sense, his own, or at least his kind's. The chapel that forms the second element of the attributed haunting is a place of burial and of prayer. The combination of the two, the royal lodging and the chapel, gives the legend a shape that is more contemplative than frightening, more sorrowful than threatening. This quality of sorrow is consistent with what the sources record about Henry VI's circumstances in his final period at the Tower. Rowan notes that he arrived having already lost his son and heir at Tewkesbury, and that the question of whether grief or violence ended his life is precisely the question the sources refuse to settle. A man in that position, whatever the manner of his death, had experienced a compression of losses that would have been difficult to survive even without external intervention. The legend takes that accumulation of loss and gives it a form, a figure that continues to move through the space where the final losses occurred, unable to leave and unable to change what happened. The specific detail of midnight and of the anniversary is worth noting because it does not appear to be arbitrary. The midnight hour has a long association in Northern European tradition with the liminal moment when ordinary time is suspended and other kinds of presence become possible. The anniversary, meanwhile, ties the apparition to a specific calendrical recurrence rather than making it a random or unpredictable phenomenon. Together, these two elements give the legend a kind of regularity that distinguishes it from a simple ghost story and gives it more the character of a ritual, something that returns because the conditions for its return are built into the structure of time itself. Whether anyone has actually witnessed what the legend describes is a question. The fact sheet for this episode does not answer in detail. The sources record the tradition without providing named witnesses for this particular apparition in the way that the 1817 Jewel House incident, to be examined elsewhere in this series, has its named witness in Edmund Lenthal Swifte. The Henry VI legend is older and less documented in its witness accounts, which is characteristic of ghost traditions that have grown up over centuries rather than being attached to a specific recorded incident with a specific date and a named observer. This does not make it less interesting, it makes it different in kind, a tradition that has accumulated through time rather than crystallizing around a single reported event. The Wakefield Tower today stands within the complex that receives, according to figures cited for 2025, nearly 2,900,000 visitors each year. The Tower of London. Officially, His Majesty's Royal Palace and Fortress of the Tower of London is cared for by the charity Historic Royal Palaces and is designated a World Heritage Site. The medieval palace, including structures related to the innermost ward, has been open to public exploration since 2006. Visitors who walk through these spaces do so within walls that have enclosed, over the course of nearly 1,000 years, a history so dense with event and consequence that the accumulated weight of it is difficult to hold in a single thought. Henry VI is one element of that weight. His reign was long, his losses were severe, and the manner of his death at the Tower remains, after more than 500 years, a question the sources hold open rather than close. The ghost tradition that has grown up around him asks the living to imagine what it might mean for a figure so weighted with loss to remain in the place where the losses reach their terminus. It does not demand belief. It asks, more gently, for a kind of attention to the tower, to the chapel, to the hour approaching midnight, and to the possibility that some residues of what happened in a place do not simply dissolve when the event is over. The Wakefield Tower was built as a residence for a king. Whether or not the figure said to pace it on its appointed night has any existence outside the tradition that records him, the building itself carries the memory of what it was built to be, and what it became, and what passed within it. That is perhaps enough to account for the particular quality of the legend, not the startling visitation of a hostile presence, but the slow, returning sorrow of a king who arrived at the Tower of London for the last time, and, by one account or another, never truly
Children
left.
who vanished. Of all the stories gathered within the walls of the Tower of London, the one that has resisted resolution most completely concerns two boys. They were not executed there, so far as anyone knows. They were not tortured, so far as the record shows. They were simply housed within the castle in the spring and summer of 1483, and then they were seen no more. The absence at the centre of their story is total, and it has proven more enduring than many of the Tower's more thoroughly documented horrors. The two boys were Edward V, King of England, and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York. Their father, Edward IV, had died in April 1483, leaving his elder son as heir to the throne at the age of 12. The uncle of the two princes, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was declared Lord Protector, while the young king was considered too young to rule. The Tower of London at this period still retained its formal association with royal coronations, the tradition of monarchs processing from the Tower to Westminster Abbey for their crowning had been maintained for at least a century and a half, and it would have been entirely in keeping with custom for the young king to be lodged there in anticipation of his coronation. The Tower, then, was not simply a prison to which the princes were consigned. It was, at that moment, also a royal palace preparing to send a king to his crowning. That coronation never took place. In June 1483, the Duke of Gloucester was proclaimed King Richard III. The two princes who had been lodged within the Tower were last seen in public that same month. What happened to them afterward is a question that has occupied historians, dramatists, and investigators for more than 5 centuries, and it remains open. The traditional account, as the sources record it, holds that the most likely explanation for the princes' disappearance is that they were murdered late in the summer of 1483. The building that has historically been associated with their fate is the Bloody Tower, which stands in the inner ward and was known by that name from the 16th century onward, the name itself understood to reflect the belief that the murder of the princes took place within its walls. But the word traditionally and the phrase most likely are doing significant work in the sources. They signal that what is being recorded is an inference, not a documented fact, and that the inference, however widely shared, has never been confirmed by evidence of the kind that would settle the matter finally. It is worth being precise about what the sources actually contain on this question, because the tradition of the princes has accumulated so many layers of claim and counterclaim over the centuries that the documented history and the accumulated legend have become difficult to separate. The Wikipedia account of the Tower notes that it has traditionally been thought that the princes were murdered late in the summer of 1483, but it is careful to present this as a traditional view rather than a proven conclusion. The same source records that bones thought to belong to the princes were discovered in 1674 during the demolition of a 12th century fore-building at the entrance to the White Tower. The reputed depth at which those bones were found, approximately 10 feet below the surface, places them at a level comparable to that of a Roman graveyard discovered in 2011 approximately 12 feet below ground in the area of the Minories, a short distance to the north. This observation does not prove that the bones found in 1674 are Roman rather than medieval, but it introduces a degree of uncertainty about their identification that the sources record and that honesty requires preserving. The bones found in 1674 may be those of the princes, or they may not be. The question of who was responsible for the disappearance of the princes, if they were indeed murdered, is likewise one that the sources present as unresolved. The traditional account has placed the blame with their uncle Richard III, and this view has been sufficiently widespread to shape the popular image of Richard's reign for centuries. But the sources used for this episode do not permit a definitive attribution. The Wikipedia account records the traditional view without endorsing it as fact beyond dispute. What can be said with confidence is that Richard III had the motive, the means, and the opportunity that the traditional account attributes to him, and equally that others, including those who benefited from the Lancastrian restoration that followed Richard's defeat at Bosworth Field in 1485, have at various points been named as alternative suspects. The sources for this episode do not adjudicate between these positions, and neither will this account. What the sources do record, and what is relevant to the haunting tradition associated with the princes, is the physical space in which the legend is set. The Bloody Tower, as it has been known since the 16th century, was originally built as a water gate providing access to the castle from the River Thames. It was a simple structure protected by a portcullis and gate, and it had been built at the same time as the inner ward's curtain wall. It acquired its later name because it was believed to be the site of the prince's murder. the naming of a building after a presumed atrocity is itself a form of tradition-making, a way of anchoring a disputed event to a specific physical location, even when the documentary record cannot supply the certainty that physical permanence seems to promise. The White Tower, meanwhile, sits at the centre of the innermost ward, the oldest and most massive structure in the complex. Its construction is usually considered to have begun in 1078, though the sources note that the exact date is uncertain. It was built by William the Conqueror, with oversight attributed to Gundulf, Bishop of Rochester. The forebuilding at its entrance, the 12th century structure demolished in 1674, whose demolition revealed the bones thought by some to be those of the princes, was thus itself a later addition to a building already several centuries old by the time the princes were housed in the tower. The layers of construction and alteration that the tower embodies mean that no single period of its history can be read in isolation from the others, and the story of the princes is embedded in a fabric of stone that carries the weight of many other histories alongside their own. The castle that enclosed the princes in 1483 was a complex of several buildings set within two concentric rings of defensive walls with a moat beyond. The innermost ward, where the White Tower stood, was the earliest part of the complex, and the structures around it had been added and altered over more than 4 centuries since William the Conqueror founded the tower toward the end of 1066. It was, by any measure, a formidable place. Its defensive walls, its towers, its moat, its restricted access from the river, all had been designed and refined over generations with the intention of keeping the castle's contents secure. That security, which in other contexts was a matter of pride and of practical military value, became, in the case of 2 small boys who depended on the protection of the very man who stood to gain most from their removal, something more troubling. The tower was very good at keeping people inside. The ghost tradition associated with the princes is notably quieter in character than some of the other hauntings attributed to the tower. The sources record the princes among the figures said to haunt the castle, but the descriptions attached to them are less specific in their physical detail than those associated with, for instance, Anne Boleyn, whose legend includes the precise detail of the White Tower and the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, or Henry VI, whose apparition is connected to the Wakefield Tower at a specific time on a specific anniversary. The tradition of the princes is more diffuse. The 2 small figures said to be seen within the castle are reported without the precision of location or timing that attaches to some of the other legends. This diffuseness may itself be meaningful. The princes disappeared without a documented record of what happened to them, and their ghost tradition mirrors that quality. They are seen or said to be seen, but where and when and under what circumstances are questions the tradition leaves as open as the historical record leaves the question of their fate. There is something consistent in this, even if the consistency was not designed. The legend shaped itself over centuries to match the history. 2 children who vanished without explanation are attributed a haunting that is itself without clear edges, without a fixed address within the castle, without a calendrical anchor. They are present in the tradition in the way that they are present in the history, incompletely, elusively, as a shape in the record rather than a fully formed account. The bones discovered in 1674 gave the tradition a physical anchor that it had previously lacked, or at least a possible one. The Wikipedia source records that they were discovered when the forebuilding of the White Tower was demolished and that they were thought to belong to the princes. The doubt introduced by the comparison with the Roman period remains found nearby does not eliminate the possibility that the bones are those of the princes, but it does mean that the identification remains uncertain. The bones were reinterred in Westminster Abbey, where they remain. Whether they are the remains of the two boys who disappeared in 1483, or of someone or several someones entirely different who happened to be buried near the base of a very old building in a city that has been continuously occupied since Roman times, is a question that has not been settled, and that current technology and the constraints around examination of the remains have so far not resolved. The unanswered quality of the prince's story has made it one of the most visited historical puzzles in English history. The Tower of London itself has served as the primary physical site of that puzzle for more than 500 years, its walls and towers providing a backdrop that gives the question a solidity it might otherwise lack. A mystery with a building attached to it is more persistent than one without. The stones of the tower, the bloody tower's name, the White Tower's forebuilding where the bones were found, these are all physical facts that hold the question in place even when the documentary evidence runs out. The opposition between Richard III and the Lancastrian claimants who succeeded him has meant that the question of the prince's fate has always been entangled with the politics of the period following 1483. Richard III was defeated at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 by the Lancastrian Henry Tudor, who ascended to the throne as Henry VII. The Tudor dynasty that followed had its own interest in the narrative of the prince's disappearance, and the sources that most forcefully attribute their murder to Richard III were produced in a period when the Tudors were in power and the reputation of Richard's regime was being actively shaped by their court historians. This does not prove that Richard was innocent, but it does mean that the most forceful versions of the traditional account were written by people with reasons to blacken the name of the man whose defeat had brought their patrons to power. The sources for this episode do not allow a more precise judgment than that. The mystery holds. The Tower of London as a physical structure continued to evolve long after 1483, but the story of the princes was absorbed into its identity in a way that no subsequent alteration has dislodged. The castle today, cared for by the charity Historic Royal Palaces and designated a World Heritage Site, receives visitors in numbers that reflect its standing as one of the country's most significant historic sites. The medieval palace structures, including elements of the innermost ward, have been open to public exploration since 2006. Visitors who walk through those spaces do so in the knowledge, however approximate, of what the sources say happened there, or may have happened, or is traditionally believed to have happened. The uncertainty is part of the experience, and it has been for a long time. The tower's role as a keeper of the nation's memory has never required that memory to be complete or conclusive. It holds contested histories alongside settled ones, and the story of the princes is perhaps the most contested of them all. The ghost tradition attached to the princes asks very little of those who encounter it. It does not require belief in the supernatural, and it does not resolve the historical question that underlies it. What it does is give a form to the particular discomfort of a disappearance that left no body, no confession, no inquest, and no sentence. In a building full of executions, whose dates and methods and victims are recorded with the precision that official proceedings produce, the princes are anomalous. They are the absence at the center of the archive, the event that generated no document of its own. The small figures said to move through the castle in the ghost tradition are, in this reading, a kind of imaginative response to that absence. History recorded everything around the princes and nothing of what happened to them. The legend fills that space with presence, however uncertain and however small, because the alternative is a silence that offers nothing to hold on to.
Whether the figures seen or said to be seen within the tower's walls have any existence beyond the tradition that records them is not a question this account can answer. What can be said is that the tradition has persisted for a very long time, that it is consistent with the historical circumstances from which it grew, and that the question it circles around, what happened to two children in the summer of 1483, is one that the stones of the Tower of London have been keeping without resolution for more than 500 years. The tower endures. The question endures with it. The two boys, who were housed within its walls in a summer that offered the older of them the prospect of a coronation, and who were never seen in public again after that summer ended, have left behind them a silence so complete that it has come, over the centuries, to sound very much like the kind of presence that silence, held long enough in the right place, eventually becomes. The Tower of London stands on the north bank of the River Thames, within the London borough of Tower Hamlets, separated from the eastern edge of the City of London by the open ground of Tower Hill. It was founded toward the end of 1066 as part of the Norman conquest, and in the centuries that followed, it accumulated a weight of human history that few buildings anywhere in the world can equal. It has been a royal residence, a treasury, an armory, a menagerie, the home of the crown jewels, and for long stretches of its life, a prison. But within all of that accumulated history, there is a smaller and more particular story, one that belongs not to the broad sweep of sieges and coronations, but to a patch of ground inside the walls, where, on rare and carefully chosen occasions, the state chose to carry out its most sensitive acts of violence in private. That patch of ground is Tower Green. Executions were, as a rule, public events. The hill to the north of the castle, known as Tower Hill, served for centuries as the principal site of execution associated with the tower, and over a period of roughly 400 years, 112 people were put to death there. These were spectacles, witnessed by crowds, conducted in the open air beyond the walls. The tower itself was used for something different, and in certain respects something more considered. Before the world wars of the 20th century, only 7 people were executed within the castle on Tower Green. The sources don't quite agree on that figure. One puts the total at 22 recorded executions within the walls across the tower's full history, while another counts only 7 before the 20th century world wars. The two figures are not easily reconciled and may reflect different methods of counting. Perhaps Tower Green executions alone against all executions within the walls across all periods. Both figures are offered by their respective sources without full explanation, and the discrepancy is preserved here as it stands. What the sources do agree upon is the reason for the distinction. As Wikipedia's article on the tower records, execution within the walls on Tower Green was reserved for prisoners for whom public execution was considered dangerous. The crowd, the open hill, the theatre of the scaffold, all of that could be turned against the state. A grieving or sympathetic public could transform a condemned person into a martyr. The walls of the tower, by contrast, offered containment. What happened inside them could be witnessed only by those the authorities chose to admit. Two of the names most closely associated with Tower Green are Lady Jane Grey and Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury. Their stories are separated by more than a decade and by very different circumstances, but they share the essential condition that made the tower's enclosed ground necessary. Both were figures whose deaths, conducted in public, might have proven more dangerous to the crown than their lives. Lady Jane Grey was briefly proclaimed Queen following the death of Edward VI. She was a young woman of learning and conviction, and her 9 days as Queen were the result not of her own ambition, as later accounts sometimes suggested, but of the manoeuvres of those around her who sought to secure a Protestant succession.
When those manoeuvres failed, and when Mary I moved to assert her claim to the throne, Jane was taken to the Tower. She had, in fact, already stayed there in happier circumstances, as was the tradition for monarchs preparing for coronation. The Tower she returned to as a prisoner was the same set of buildings, the same stone, the same river light, but the meaning of the place had been entirely transformed. On the 12th of February, 1554, Lady Jane Grey was executed on Tower Green. She was, by most accounts, still a teenager. The decision to conduct the execution within the walls rather than on Tower Hill reflected the anxiety that surrounded her case. Sir Thomas Wyatt had led a revolt against Queen Mary in the name, at least ostensibly, of the Protestant cause, and Jane, whatever her own wishes, had become a symbol around which opposition might coalesce. To execute her publicly before the London crowds was to risk making her a martyr. The walls of the Tower absorbed her death instead. After Jane's execution, her sister Elizabeth, later Queen Elizabeth I, was imprisoned in the Tower under suspicion of having encouraged rebellion, the Wyatt revolt having been conducted partly in her name. Elizabeth survived, Jane did not, and her burial within the precincts of the Tower placed her among those whose remains were kept close to the place of their deaths. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, belongs to an earlier chapter of Tudor violence, and her story carries a particular quality of prolonged misfortune. She was among the last of the Plantagenet line, and that bloodline alone made her a source of unease to the Tudor monarchy. Her son, Reginald Pole, had openly opposed Henry VIII's break with Rome and his treatment of Catherine of Aragon, writing against the king from the relative safety of the continent. The king's anger at the son fell upon the mother, who remained in England and within reach. Margaret was taken to the Tower, where she was held for a period before her execution. Her death, when it came, was carried out on Tower Green, within the walls, among the select number of executions that the Tower's enclosed space was designed to accommodate. She was elderly at the time of her execution, and her death is among those that later writers and chroniclers have treated as emblematic of the cruelties of the Henrician period. The fact sheet notes that Margaret Pole is reported among the Tower's ghosts, placing her alongside Jane Grey and Anne Boleyn as a figure whose presence is said to persist within the walls. It is worth pausing on what it means for a ghost to be associated with a private execution rather than a public one. The haunting tradition attached to the Tower is large and varied. Anne Boleyn's ghost is said to walk near the White Tower and to haunt the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, where she is buried, and she is described as the spirit most often reported by visitors. Henry VI is said to pace the Wakefield Tower as midnight approaches on the anniversary of his death. Guy Fawkes is said to be heard rather than seen, his cries of anguish associated with the area beneath the White Tower where he was most likely tortured. These are figures whose stories were large, whose names were known across the country and beyond it. Their hauntings, in the popular imagination, carry a corresponding scale. The hauntings attributed to Lady Jane Grey and Margaret Pole are quieter presences in the tradition, though no less grounded in the record of what happened to them. The distinction may reflect something about the nature of the deaths themselves. An execution conducted in public on Tower Hill before hundreds of witnesses generates a different kind of memory from one conducted within walls before a controlled and limited audience. The public execution is immediately absorbed into the life of the city, written about, spoken of, commemorated in ballads and broadsides. The private execution disappears into stone and silence. What emerges from that silence, if the haunting tradition is taken seriously, is a different kind of presence, not the dramatic apparition striding through a courtyard
carrying its own head, but something more confined, more restless, more particular to the small space in which the death occurred. The Church of St. Peter at Vincula, the Norman chapel that was incorporated into the castle during the expansion under Henry III, stands within the inner ward. It was rebuilt by Edward I at a cost of over £300 and rebuilt again by Henry VIII in 1519, so that the current building dates from that later period, though it was refurbished again in the 19th century. Anne Boleyn is buried there, and the chapel has long been associated with the women and men whose executions within the tower's walls placed their bodies under its care. The proximity of the chapel to Tower Green is not incidental. The architecture of private execution was also the architecture of private burial. There was no public funeral, no procession through the streets, no tomb in a cathedral visible to pilgrims. There was the chapel, the precincts, the walls. The tower never had a permanent torture chamber, and the popular image of underground dungeons given over entirely to systematic cruelty is a product of 16th century religious propagandists and 19th century romanticists rather than historical record. Between 1540 and 1640, the peak period of imprisonment at the Tower, there were 48 recorded cases of torture. Joe Rowan, writing for Sky History in 2020, notes a similar figure, observing that records show only 48 prisoners at the Tower were subjected to physical torture, though she adds the observation that many more likely experienced psychological torments such as starvation or isolation. The Tower's reputation as a place of unrelenting horror exceeds what the documentary record supports, but the documentary record remains, by any measure, dark enough. What the record of Jane Grey and Margaret Pole reflects is not the spectacular cruelty of the torture chamber, but the quieter cruelty of administrative violence, the King's Council deciding that a person's death was necessary, that it should be conducted out of sight, and that the walls of the Tower were the appropriate container for that decision. The castle had been designed from the beginning to communicate power. William the Conqueror founded it toward the end of 1066, and the White Tower, begun in 1078, though its exact construction date remains uncertain, was from its earliest days understood as a symbol of dominance over a city that had not been conquered willingly. The historian's phrasing in the Wikipedia source is precise on this point. The White Tower was initially a resented symbol of oppression. Its stones were not neutral, they were chosen to press upon the consciousness of those who looked at them. In the centuries that followed, the Tower accumulated many layers of meaning over that original one, but the meaning of control, of the state's power to contain and to act upon individuals within its walls, persisted throughout. The executions on Tower Green were an expression of that control in its most concentrated form. They were, in a sense, the Tower's ultimate function made visible, not the treasury, not the armory, not the menagerie with its bears and lions and the polar bear fishing in the Thames on a chain, but the simple and terrible fact that the walls could be used to make a death invisible to the world outside. The ghost stories that attach to Lady Jane Grey and Margaret Pole can be read, if one is inclined to read them that way, as a kind of counter-pressure against that invisibility. The haunting tradition is, among other things, a form of memory, a way in which places preserve and retransmit the emotional weight of what happened within them. Whether or not one believes that the dead return, there is something worth attending to in the pattern of where the Tower's ghosts are said to appear and who they are said to be. They are, almost without exception, figures whose deaths were attended by injustice in some form, whether legal or moral, whose ends were determined by the power of others rather than by any natural conclusion to their lives. Jane Grey was still a teenager when she died on Tower Green,
her exact age uncertain, but likely no more than 16 or 17 years old. She had been queen for 9 days, a circumstance she had not sought, and she died for it. Margaret Pole was the last surviving member of the Plantagenet line, killed in the final years of a long life because her son had written letters that displeased a king. Neither death was the result of a crime in any meaningful sense. Both were the result of the exercise of power by those who had more of it than the women they destroyed. The walls that enclosed those deaths are still standing. The chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula still stands within them. The ground of Tower Green is still there, maintained now as part of one of the country's most visited historical sites, with more than 2.5 million visitors recorded in 2025. The tourist who walks across that ground is walking across the same surface that Jane Grey walked across on the morning of her execution, the same surface on which Margaret Pole died. The stones of the White Tower, built from Kentish ragstone with Caen stone brought from northern France for facing details, and Reigate stone used elsewhere in the structure, are still largely the original stones, or stones laid over the same foundations in the same configurations. This persistence of material is part of what makes the tower's haunting tradition feel different from ghost stories attached to buildings that no longer exist, or that have been so thoroughly rebuilt as to retain nothing of their original fabric. The tower has been repaired, expanded, and in some areas demolished and reconstructed, but its essential character has remained continuous across nearly 1,000 years. The same walls, the same enclosed ground, the same chapel. The question of whether Lady Jane Grey or Margaret Pole are truly present in that space in any literal sense is not one that this account can answer, nor should it try to. What can be said with confidence and without embellishment is that the tradition placing them among the tower's ghosts is consistent with a broader pattern of haunting reports from the site, a pattern that the sources trace without resolution or explanation. The tower holds its dead, or is said to hold them. Among those dead, 2 women whose executions were conducted in private, behind walls, on the small patch of ground inside the inner ward, remain among the figures most associated with the idea that the place has not entirely released what happened within it. The night staff of the tower, in more recent times, have reported nameless and formless apparitions, presences that resist identification and description. Whether those presences have any connection to the named figures of the historical record, to Jane, to Margaret, to the others buried in the chapel or lost in the foundations, is something the sources do not claim to know. The tower keeps its silence on this, as it has kept silence on much else. The walls that were built to contain are still containing, and whatever they contain, they have not yet given
Voice
it up.
Beneath the White Tower. Of all the figures said to haunt the Tower of London, Guy Fawkes is perhaps the most unusual. The tower itself stands on the north bank of the River Thames, within the London borough of Tower Hamlets, separated from the eastern edge of the City of London by the open ground of Tower Hill. It was founded toward the end of 1066 as part of the Norman conquest, built by William the Conqueror as a fortification, a residence, and a statement of power over a city that had yielded to him only after its supply lines were cut and its leaders isolated. At its heart stands the White Tower, whose construction is generally considered to have begun in 1078, though the exact date remains uncertain. William made Gundulf, Bishop of Rochester, responsible for overseeing the work. The principal building material was Kentish ragstone, with Caen stone imported from northern France for facing details, and Reigate stone used as ashlar and for carved elements. It is a structure built to endure, and it has endured, carrying within its walls nearly 1,000 years of the country's most turbulent history. For much of its life, the tower served as a prison, and the 16th and 17th centuries marked the height of that use. Political and religious undesirables passed through its gates in considerable numbers during those years. Among the most famous of them arrived on the 6th of November, 1605, a man brought in under guard, his name already known across England. That man was Guy Fawkes. The story of what brought Fawkes to the Tower begins not within its walls, but beneath the Palace of Westminster, where he and a group of co-conspirators had smuggled barrels of gunpowder into a cellar with the intention of destroying the building during the state opening of Parliament. The plan, which has since become known as the Gunpowder Plot, was aimed at killing James I and the assembled Parliament in a single catastrophic act. Fawkes was discovered in the cellar, the gunpowder around him, and was taken into custody. He was brought to the Tower of London on the 6th of November, 1605. What followed was an ordeal that the Tower's records document with the particular precision of an institution accustomed to such work. The Privy Council had to sanction the use of torture, and it was not employed casually or frequently. Between 1540 and 1640, the period that represents the peak of the Tower's use as a prison, there were 48 recorded cases of torture carried out within its walls. The three most common methods employed were the rack, the scavenger's daughter, and manacles. Fawkes, as a man who possessed information about his co-conspirators, information the Crown urgently needed, was subjected to that process. After torture, he signed a full confession to the Gunpowder Plot. The location most associated with his suffering is the area beneath the White Tower itself. It is worth dwelling on that structure for a moment, because the physical reality of the building informs the atmosphere that later centuries would attach to it. The White Tower is a keep, a donjon, the strongest point of the early castle. It measures approximately 36 by 32 metres at its base, and rises to 27 metres at its southern battlements. Its lowest level is a basement, partially below ground on its northern side, because the tower was terraced into the side of a mound. That basement was, as was typical of Norman keeps, an undercroft used for storage. It is lit through small slits. In later periods, the basement of the White Tower housed a rack. The Tower of London never had a permanent torture chamber, but the instruments of interrogation found their way into this lowest and most lightless part of its oldest structure. Despite the popular image of the Tower as a place saturated in torture, that image owes a great deal to forces that are themselves worth examining. The Tower's reputation for torture and imprisonment derives largely from 16th century religious propagandists and 19th century romanticists. Writers amplified what the records show more soberly, and the Tower became, in the popular imagination, something darker than its documented history entirely warrants. The historical writer William Harrison Ainsworth, in his novel about the Tower, created a vivid image of underground torture chambers and devices for extracting confessions that fixed itself in public memory. What the records actually show is a place of considerable complexity, capable of both comfort and cruelty, where the line between political imprisonment and ordinary residence could, for some fortunate prisoners, be quite permeable. For Guy Fawkes, there was no such comfort. His torture was a documented fact. His confession was extracted and signed. The records do not describe what he said in that basement room, or how long the process took, or what sounds he made. Those details, if they were ever written down, have not survived in the sources available to us. What survives is the bare administrative record, the arrival date, the order to torture, the signed confession. The legend that grew around his suffering is of a different order entirely. According to the account preserved by Joe Rowan, writing about the Tower's historic hauntings, the punishment inflicted on Fawkes appears to have left something behind. Some have claimed to hear his pained cries of anguish and pleas for mercy in the area beneath the White Tower long after his execution. This is not a visual haunting of the kind more commonly reported at the Tower. There is no figure seen walking a particular route, no face at a window, no apparition in period dress. What is reported is sound alone, cries and pleas, unattached to any visible presence, rising from the part of the castle most associated with the torture that produced his confession. It is a distinction that the ghost lore of the Tower does not often make. Most of the figures said to haunt this place are seen. Anne Boleyn is described as walking in the courtyard and near the chapel where she is buried, and in some accounts carrying her head beneath her arm. Henry VI is said to pace the Wakefield Tower as midnight approaches on the anniversary of his death. Lady Jane Grey, Margaret Pole, the princes in the Tower, all of them are described in visual terms, figures glimpsed or observed. Fawkes alone is reported through hearing rather than sight. There is something worth considering in that difference. Fawkes was not executed at the Tower. He was brought there, tortured there, and made to confess there, but his execution took place elsewhere, at Westminster, in January of 1606. And it is the suffering, according to the tradition that has attached itself to the place, that lingers, rather than the man himself. The Tower's documentation of torture is unusual in being relatively precise. The 48 recorded cases across the peak century span of 1540 to 1640 represent a smaller number than the building's reputation would suggest, and the Privy Council's requirement to sanction each use meant that torture was, at least formally, a regulated act rather than a casual one. Joe Rowan's account notes that records show 48 prisoners at the Tower were subjected to physical torture, though the position she presents is that many more prisoners likely experienced psychological torments such as starvation or isolation, forms of suffering that left no mark in the formal record. The documented number, in other words, may represent only one part of the experience of those held within the walls. Fawkes was among the documented cases. He arrived as a man who had refused to give his real name, calling himself John Johnson, and his resistance to interrogation in the first days after his arrest was noted. The confession that torture eventually produced named his co-conspirators and gave the Crown the information it required. After signing, Fawkes was eventually transferred out of the Tower to await trial. His signature on the confession document, by many accounts, a shaking, barely legible mark quite different from signatures he had produced before his imprisonment, has been taken as evidence of the severity of what he had endured. It is worth being careful here. Neither the appearance of his signature nor the condition it implies is directly attested in the sources that inform this script, and the claim should be understood as a matter of wider historical record, not confirmed within the sources available here. What the available sources do confirm is that Fawkes was brought to the Tower on the 6th of November 1605, that he was tortured, and that he signed a full confession. They confirm that the torture most likely took place in the chambers below the White Tower. They confirm that the gunpowder plot was directed against James I and the sitting Parliament. And they confirm that the legend attached to that part of the castle describes something heard rather than seen, cries of anguish and pleas for mercy, said to persist long after the man himself was gone. Its ragstone walls, laid down in the final years of the 11th century under the direction of Gundulf of Rochester, have absorbed nearly 1,000 years of the country's most consequential events. The castle, of which it forms the oldest surviving part, has been an armoury, a treasury, a royal residence, a menagerie, a mint, and a prison. It has housed kings and condemned them. It has sheltered queens and executed them. Its history is one in which the full range of human experience, from ceremony to suffering, from celebration to despair, has been enacted within a relatively small area of ground on the north bank of the Thames. The basement of the White Tower, with its small slit windows and its brick-vaulted interior, most of which dates from the 18th century when the floor was lowered and the earlier timber vaults replaced, is a quiet place now. Visitors move through it on their way to other parts of the building. The armoury exhibits stand in the upper rooms. The Chapel of St. John occupies the southeastern corner of the upper floor, bare and unadorned in a way that is reminiscent, as the building's historians have noted, of how it would have appeared in the Norman period. The rack that once stood in the basement is no longer there. The instruments of the Privy Council's sanctioned interrogations have long since been removed or dispersed. The records of 48 documented cases remain in the archives, patient and precise. What the legend insists is that one of those cases left something more than a paper record, that below the oldest stone in the tower, in the lightless lower chambers where the instruments were kept and the questions were asked, the sounds of a particular November more than 400 years ago have not entirely faded. Cries. A voice that belongs to no figure that can be seen. Whether one places any weight on such accounts is a matter entirely for the listener. The sources from which this script draws are careful to present the tradition without affirming it. Joe Rowan's account describes it as something claimed by those who have spent time in that part of the castle, a persistent legend attached to a documented event. The torture of Guy Fawkes in November 1605 is part of the Tower's administrative record, one of 48 cases in a century-long archive of state-sanctioned interrogation. The legend that has grown around it is something else, something the records do not contain and cannot confirm, a story told in the dark about what stone walls might retain. The tower stands, as it has stood for close to 1,000 years, on its patch of ground by the Thames, receiving its visitors, housing its ravens, displaying its jewels. Below the White Tower, the basement sits in its characteristic dimness, the slit windows admitting their narrow measure of light, the brick vaulting overhead. And somewhere in the tradition of the place, in the accumulated accounts of those who have walked those lower rooms at quiet hours, there is a sound that some say they have heard, not a figure, not a face.
In January of 1816, a sentry stood guard outside the Jewel House at the Tower of London. What he reported encountering that night became one of the most singular and enduring accounts in the Tower's long record of strange occurrences. According to the account preserved in the historical record, the sentry claimed to have witnessed an apparition of a bear advancing toward him. He was reported to have died of fright a few days later. The Tower of London stands on the north bank of the River Thames, within the London borough of Tower Hamlets, at the eastern edge of the City of London. It was founded toward the end of 1066 as part of the Norman conquest, and the White Tower, which gives the whole complex its name, was begun by William the Conqueror, with construction overseen by Gundulf, Bishop of Rochester. By the time the sentry took his post in the winter of 1816, the fortress had stood, in one form or another, for the better part of 7.5 centuries. It had served, at various points in its history, as a royal residence, an armoury, a treasury, a menagerie, the home of the Royal Mint, a public record office, and, most pertinently to the atmosphere of that January night, the home of the crown jewels. The jewel house in which the crown jewels were kept had its own layered history within the wider complex. The tradition of housing the crown jewels at the Tower of London is thought to date to the reign of Henry III. By the early 19th century, the jewels had long been a draw for visitors and a focus of ceremonial attention, and the jewel house was accordingly a place whose guarding carried a certain gravity. A sentry posted outside it was not there idly. He was part of a chain of custodial tradition stretching back centuries. The winter of 1816 was deep in what was an unsettled period for the Tower. The fortress was no longer a royal residence in any active sense, and the grand palatial functions it had once served had been stripped away over the preceding 2 centuries. The buildings were, in several parts, in a state of relative emptiness. In the latter part of the previous century, institutions had begun their long process of departure from the Tower's walls. What remained was a garrison, a set of ceremonial functions, and an increasingly pronounced sense of the place as a repository of history rather than a site of living power. Into this atmosphere the sentry took his post. The account states simply that in January 1816, a sentry on guard outside the jewel house claimed to have witnessed an apparition of a bear advancing toward him. The record does not elaborate on the precise hour, or on whether the night was clear or overcast, or on the exact position the sentry occupied when the apparition appeared. What the account does preserve is the essential shape of the encounter and its consequence. The sentry was reported to have died of fright a few days after the incident. There is a particular quality to this account that separates it from others collected in the Tower's folklore. The ghost of Anne Boleyn, the most frequently reported presence at the Tower, carries with it a legible human narrative. The reported pacing of Henry VI through the Wakefield Tower is connected, by those who record it, to the recognizable grief of a deposed king. The bear carries none of that. It arrives without context, without biography, without any obvious emotional logic. It is simply an animal, or the form of one, moving toward a man in the dark. The tower had in fact housed bears. The royal menagerie, which operated within the tower's walls for several centuries, had at various points included bears among its inhabitants. A polar bear given to Henry III by Haakon IV of Norway in 1252 had been permitted to fish in the Thames while secured to the land by a chain, and had attracted considerable attention from Londoners at the time. A large grizzly bear, known as Old Martin, given to George III by the Hudson's Bay Company in 1811, had been a particularly well-known resident of the menagerie in the years immediately preceding 1816. The menagerie was still operating in January of 1816, and so bears, as living animals, were not entirely absent from the tower's precincts during this period. Yet the Sentry's account was not a report of an escaped animal. It was a report of an apparition. The distinction, as recorded, is clear enough. He did not describe a bear that had broken free from its enclosure. He described something that advanced toward him in a manner and with a quality that he understood as supernatural, and the reported consequence, his death from fright within days, is itself part of the account as it has come down to us. Whether the two facts, the presence of living bears in the tower's menagerie in that period and the Sentry's reported vision of an advancing bear, had any connection, is not addressed by the sources available. The account does not reach for that connection, and the record as preserved does not draw it. The menagerie would continue operating for some years after 1816, with its closure ordered by the Duke of Wellington following the death of George IV in 1830, and the bulk of its animals transferred to the London Zoo, which had opened in 1828. The last of the animals left the tower in 1835. But in January of 1816, bear and man alike occupied the same fortress, the living animals in their enclosures, and something else, according to the Sentry, somewhere near the Jewel House. The tower's history had, by 1816, already accumulated a considerable weight of reported strangeness. The account of the Sentry and the bear sits within that broader record, but it does not quite belong to the same register as the other reports. The tower's more familiar hauntings are, in the main, hauntings of people. They are the residue, as those who report them tend to frame it, of specific human suffering in specific places within the complex. The bear offers no such framing. It does not grieve or pace or carry its head. It simply advances. The Jewel House itself had a history of reported incidents. The following year, in October of 1817, the keeper of the crown jewels, a man named Edmund Lenthal Swifte, would report a glowing tubular apparition within the Jewel House, which he said hovered over the shoulder of his wife, and which she reportedly cried out had seized her. That account, made by a named official of the tower in circumstances that allowed for a degree of corroboration, would attract considerable attention, but the Sentry's account preceded it by the better part of 2 years, and it remained in its way the stranger of the two. Swifte was a known figure, a keeper of records as much as of jewels, a man whose account could be placed within a human and institutional context. The Sentry, as the record comes to us, is largely without a name attached to the published account. He is defined in the story by his post, his experience, and his reported death. The nature of that death is worth pausing over, not to explain it, but simply to note what the record says. He was reported to have died of fright. This phrasing, preserved in the account as we have it, is not a medical description. It belongs to a particular tradition of recording encounters with the uncanny, one in which the boundary between the fright and the death is not interrogated, but simply stated. Whether the Sentry's death had a medical cause that his contemporaries attributed to the shock of the encounter, or whether the report of his death was itself an elaboration that accrued to the story over time, the sources available to this account do not say. What they preserve is the account in the form it has reached us: a sentry, a bear, a death within days. The Tower of London has never had a permanent torture chamber, despite a popular reputation to the contrary that was largely the creation of 16th century religious propagandists and 19th century writers. The basement of the White Tower housed a rack in later periods, but the Gothic apparatus of permanent subterranean horror that the tower came to represent in the popular imagination was substantially a literary construction, and yet accounts such as the Sentry's bear suggest that the imaginative weight the tower had accumulated by the early 19th century was not merely the product of popular fiction. Something about the place, its centuries of use as a prison for high-status individuals, its association with executions carried out both within its walls and on Tower Hill to the north, its long enclosure of the lives and deaths of people who had fallen from power, produced an atmosphere in which a man standing guard on a winter night might see, or believe he saw, something advancing toward him in the dark. The count of executions carried out inside the tower's walls is itself a matter on which the sources do not agree. Accounts differ on the number. One source holds that only 7 people were executed within the tower before the world wars of the 20th century, while another puts the total of recorded executions inside the walls at 22. According to one account, only 7 people were executed within the tower before the world wars of the 20th century, while another puts the total of all recorded executions inside its walls at 22. The two figures may count different things, reflecting perhaps a distinction between executions on Tower Green specifically and all executions within the wider complex. Neither account resolves the discrepancy, and both are recorded here as their respective sources give them. What is not in dispute is that the tower was a place in which people had died, sometimes violently, sometimes in circumstances that their contemporaries and successors found troubling. The Sentry of January 1816 was not the first person to report something strange within the complex, and he would not be the last. He was, however, the source of an account that remains among the most purely strange that the tower has produced, not because it involves a figure from history whose grief or anger might provide a framework for understanding it, but because it does not. A bear, unnamed, unaccounted for, advancing through the January dark toward a man at his post. The man, as the record tells it, did not survive the encounter by many days. The account has been preserved, passed along, and sits now in the record of a place that has been accumulating such accounts for the better part of 1,000 years. It asks nothing of the listener. It does not reach for meaning. It simply stands as the tower itself stands at the edge of the city, holding what it holds. The Tower of London stands on the north bank of the River Thames, at the eastern edge of the City of London, within the borough of Tower Hamlets. It was founded toward the end of 1066, in the aftermath of the Norman conquest, by William the Conqueror, the invading Duke of Normandy, who had secured his victory at the Battle of Hastings and moved quickly to consolidate his hold over England's largest city. The structure that would grow into one of the most complex fortified sites in Europe began as something comparatively modest, an enclosure of timber and earth built into the corner of London's old Roman walls, using those ancient defences as a ready-made foundation. From that beginning, over centuries of expansion and rebuilding, the tower accumulated towers and wards, walls and moats, chapels and storehouses, a menagerie, a mint, a record office, and the safekeeping of the crown jewels of England. It accumulated, too, a long and densely populated history of imprisonment, execution, and the particular kind of dread that attaches itself to places where power and suffering have shared the same walls for generations. This series is concerned with that dread, and with the accounts, some named and some not, that have gathered around the tower across the centuries. Not all of those accounts are equal. Some belong to tradition, to folklore, to the slow accretion of story that any ancient building collects simply by standing long enough. Others are attached to specific names, specific dates, specific roles. The account at the center of this chapter belongs to the second category. It is the report made by Edmund Lenthal Swifte, the keeper of the crown jewels, concerning what he said he witnessed in the jewel house in October 1817. It is, by the measures available to this kind of history, one of the more precisely documented of the tower's ghost stories, a named official, a named month and year, and a named location. That does not settle what happened. It does mean that the account has a weight and a traceability that many others lack. Before turning to Swifte and his account, it is worth understanding what the jewel house was and where it stood in the life of the tower. The tradition of housing the crown jewels at the tower probably dates from the reign of Henry III, who ruled from 1216 to 1272. A dedicated jewel house was built to hold the royal regalia, those objects of crown, sceptre, and sword that carried the symbolic weight of monarchy itself. The position of keeper of those objects was not a minor one. In the reign of Edward III, who ruled from 1327 to 1377, the holder of the equivalent post was paid 12 pence a day, a sum that reflected the seriousness with which the Crown regarded the custody of its most significant portable property. The jewels had been dispersed once during the Commonwealth period following the execution of Charles I, when they were broken apart and the metal sent to the mint to be melted down. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, replacements had to be made for the coronation of Charles II, and new regalia was created based on earlier records and drawings. From 1669, the crown jewels were placed on display for the paying public in Martin Tower. This arrangement continued with modifications, and by the early 19th century, the jewel house remained a place of both formal custody and public access, a room within the tower that combined the functions of treasury and exhibition. By 1817, the man responsible for that custody was Edmund Lenthal Swifte, whose title was Keeper of the Crown Jewels. It is because of that title and the responsibility it carried that Swifte's account has been preserved and repeated. He was not a casual visitor or an anonymous sentry. He held a recognized official position within the tower's administrative structure, and his name was attached to the account from the beginning. What Swifte reported was this: in October 1817, a tubular, glowing apparition appeared in the jewel house. He said that the apparition hovered over the shoulder of his wife and that she cried out in response to it. The words attributed to her, as recorded by the Wikipedia account, which draws on earlier documentation, were, "O Christ, it has seized me." Quote, "Those words, if they were spoken, carry the quality of an involuntary response rather than a considered description. They suggest not observation, but reaction, the feeling of something physical rather than purely visual." Swifte himself described the apparition as tubular and glowing. These are not the standard materials of ghost story tradition, which tends toward the recognizably human, a figure, a face, a gesture. What Swifte described was formless in the human sense, a shape without obvious precedent in the catalogue of tower hauntings that would later grow up around the building. It did not resemble a beheaded queen or a pacing king. It was something stranger than that, and in some ways harder to account for by the usual mechanisms of imagination and expectation. It is worth pausing here to consider what the jewel house was like as a physical space and what conditions might have prevailed there in October of that year. The tower's buildings had gone through considerable change in the preceding century and a half. The innermost ward, where the earliest palace buildings had stood, had been cleared between 1666 and 1676, with many structures removed and the jewel house demolished in 1669, at which point the crown jewels were moved to Martin Tower. The building in which Swifte served was therefore not the original jewel house, but a later arrangement within a complex of structures that had been repeatedly adapted, repurposed, and in some cases rebuilt. The tower, as Swifte knew it in 1817, was already a layered place, its current surfaces resting on earlier configurations, its rooms carrying in their fabric the alterations of many different reigns and purposes. The jewel house was a room associated above all with custody and value, and with the public display of objects that embodied the continuity of the monarchy. It was, in other words, a room in which the symbolic weight of centuries was quite deliberately concentrated. Swifte's account does not stand alone in the record of strange experiences reported at the jewel house. Less than a year earlier, in January 1816, a sentry on guard outside the jewel house reported an apparition of a bear advancing toward him. The bear, in the context of the tower's history, is not an entirely arbitrary shape for a reported apparition to take. The tower had housed a royal menagerie for several centuries, and bears had been among its most notable inhabitants. The last of the menagerie's animals would not leave until 1835, and in 1816 the collection was still present on site. Whether the sentry's account reflected an encounter with an actual escaped animal, a trick of light and shadow in the early hours of a January morning, or something else entirely, the record does not resolve. What the record states is that the sentry was reported to have died of fright a few days after his encounter. This claim, striking as it is, cannot be independently verified from the sources available to this account, and should be understood as part of the reported tradition rather than as a confirmed biographical fact. The proximity of the two accounts, the sentry's bear in January 1816 and Swifte's tubular light in October 1817, is notable. The jewel house appears in both. Both accounts involve witnesses in official or quasi-official roles, a sentry on guard duty, a keeper in his place of professional responsibility. Both describe something seen rather than heard, a visual experience with no obvious natural explanation offered by the witnesses themselves, and both have been preserved in the record precisely because the witnesses occupied positions that gave their accounts a particular kind of credibility, not the credibility of scientific proof, but the credibility of named individuals with defined responsibilities who reported something they found inexplicable. That is a different kind of evidence than rumour, and it is the kind that tends to endure. Swifte's account specifically endured because it was precise. He named himself, named his wife as present, named the room, and provided a month and year. He described the form of the apparition, tubular and glowing, in terms that were specific enough to be quoted and transmitted through subsequent accounts of the tower's haunting tradition. The detail of his wife's cry that it had seized her adds a dimension to the account that a purely visual description would not carry. Whatever she experienced was not only seen but felt, or at least described as felt, in that moment of alarm. Whether that detail was present in Swifte's original account or was added or elaborated in subsequent transmission, the sources available to this series do not allow us to say with full confidence. What can be said is that the account has been a stable feature of the tower's reported ghost tradition from at least the time it entered the documented record. Joe Rowan, writing for the Sky History Channel in 2020, notes in a broader survey of the tower's hauntings that only 22 recorded executions have taken place inside the tower's walls, a figure that stands in some contrast to the building's formidable reputation. That reputation, as the Wikipedia account of the tower makes clear, derives in part from the work of 16th century religious propagandists and 19th century writers, who found in the tower a ready symbol of oppression and suffering. The ghost stories of the tower exist within that larger tradition of reputation building, and it is not always easy to separate the accounts that rest on named witnesses from those that rest on accumulated legend. Swifte's account is valuable precisely because it sits more firmly in the first category. The figure of the keeper of the crown jewels carries its own weight in this context. The crown jewels are, by definition, objects of national significance. Their keeper was a man of standing, accountable not only for his custody of those objects, but for his conduct in the role. To report a supernatural occurrence in the room in which one held official responsibility was not, in 1817, an obviously advantageous thing to do. It is possible to imagine reasons why such a report might have been made: genuine belief in what was witnessed, a desire to explain an experience that had disturbed the household, a wish to account for the evident distress of his wife. What it is harder to imagine is that such a report was made lightly by a man in that position, in that place, in that year. The White Tower, which gives the entire castle its name, had been begun by William the Conqueror in 1078, though the exact date is uncertain, and was overseen in its construction by Gundulf, the Bishop of Rochester. It was built from Kentish ragstone, the main structural material, with Caen stone imported from northern France for facing details, and Reigate stone used for carved elements, though much of the original Caen stone facing was replaced with Portland stone in the 17th and 18th centuries. The Church of St. Peter at Vincula, a Norman chapel that had previously stood outside the tower's walls, was incorporated into the complex during the expansion carried out under Henry III in the 13th century. These structures, the White Tower, the chapel, the towers of the inner and outer wards, accumulated their histories across the same centuries that produced the events most associated with the tower's haunting tradition. The jewel house in which Swifte stood watch in 1817 was embedded in this longer history. The crown jewels had travelled through the tower's architecture, moving from one custodial location to another as the buildings around them changed. The objects themselves had been destroyed and remade, the regalia of one era reconstituted in the era that followed. If the tower's hauntings are understood, in the terms that the tradition itself offers, as the persistence of the past in the present, then the jewel house was a room particularly saturated with such persistence. The objects it held were themselves acts of memory, replacements for what had been lost, fashioned to resemble and to carry forward the authority of what no longer existed. Whether any of this bears on what Swifte and his wife experienced in October 1817 is not a question this account can answer. The sources do not explain the tubular, glowing shape, and this account does not attempt to do so. What the sources provide is a named man, in a named place, in a named month and year, reporting something that he believed to have occurred. His wife was present, she cried out, he recorded it. The account passed into the tower's tradition and remained there, attached to his name and his office across the following 2 centuries. In the broader landscape of the tower's reported hauntings, Swifte's account occupies a particular position. It is not the most frequently cited of the tower's ghost stories. That distinction belongs, by the measure of repeated reference in the sources available to this series, to the apparition of Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, who was executed in the courtyard on the 19th of May, 1536, convicted of treason against the king. Her ghost is described as the spirit most often reported by visitors, said to walk near the White Tower carrying her head under her arm, and to haunt the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where she is buried. The chapel itself is part of the tower's inner fabric, incorporated from outside the walls in the 13th century, rebuilt by Edward I at a cost of over £300, and rebuilt again by Henry VIII in 1519, with the current building dating from that period. That Anne Boleyn's ghost should be associated with the place of her burial is a logic the tradition understands well. Swifte's account follows a different logic. It is not about a recognizable figure from the tower's history, not a queen returning to the place of her burial, or a king reliving the night of his death. It is about a shape, a light, something that hovered, and, if the cry of the woman present is to be believed as evidence of a physical sensation, something that touched, that combination of anomalous appearance and apparent physical contact is unusual in the tower's ghost tradition, as it has been recorded in the sources available to this series, and it is part of what gives the account its particular quality of unease. The Tower of London was, by 1817, already a tourist attraction of some standing, having drawn visitors since at least the Elizabethan period. The crown jewels had been on public display since 1669, and the jewel house was among the tower's most visited spaces. Swifte's account was therefore an account attached to one of the most publicly prominent rooms in one of the most publicly prominent buildings in the country. The keeper of the crown jewels was not a figure in the margins of the tower's life. He was, in the terms of the tower's administrative structure, a man at its centre. That this man reported in the autumn of 1817 that something formless and glowing had appeared in the room in which he held his most significant professional responsibility, and that his wife had cried out that it had seized her, is a fact of the tower's documented history, in the sense that it has been recorded in sources that have persisted and been treated as reliable by those who have written about the tower's hauntings. What it means remains, as it has always remained, open. The tower stands tonight, as it has stood for close to 1,000 years, on the north bank of the Thames, at the edge of the old city. Its stones are the stones of many different centuries, laid down by many different hands, for many different purposes. The room in which Edmund Lenthal Swifte stood with his wife in October 1817 is part of that fabric, as are the objects he guarded, the institution he served, and the account he left behind him. That account, precise in its particulars and unexplained in its substance, belongs now to the long tradition of the tower's haunting, and it rests there, calmly, among all the other things the tower has not yet given up. The Tower of London stands on the north bank of the River Thames, within the London borough of Tower Hamlets, at the eastern edge of the old city of London. It has stood there for close to 1,000 years, founded in the late months of 1066 as part of the Norman conquest of England. The White Tower, which gives the whole castle its name, was begun by William the Conqueror, with construction overseen by Gundulf, Bishop of Rochester, the exact start date uncertain, but generally considered to have been around 1078. The building that rose from that uncertain beginning was constructed from Kentish ragstone, with Caen stone imported from northern France for the facing details, and Reigate stone used for carved work and ashlar courses. Much of the original Caen stone facing was later replaced with Portland stone during the 17th and 18th centuries, so that what visitors see today is in many places a later surface laid over an ancient interior. The structure is not a single building, but a complex of towers and walls arranged in two concentric rings with a moat encircling the whole. For most of its long life, the tower has been a working place rather than a monument. It has served at various points as a royal residence, an armoury, a treasury, a mint, a public record office, a menagerie, and the home of the crown jewels of England. It has also been a prison, and it is that role, more than any other, that has settled most deeply into the public imagination. The zenith of the tower's use as a place of imprisonment fell in the 16th and 17th centuries, when those who had fallen out of royal favour, or who were suspected of political or religious dissent, found themselves conducted through its gates. The phrase "sent to the tower" carried, and still carries, a weight that no bureaucratic description quite captures. Today the tower is something else again. It is officially His Majesty's Royal Palace and Fortress of the Tower of London, cared for by the charity Historic Royal Palaces, and it receives millions of visitors each year. The yeoman warders walk its grounds as they have done since at least 1509, conducting tours and maintaining the ceremonial life of the castle. At least 6 ravens are kept within the walls at all times, in accordance with the tradition that if the ravens depart, the kingdom will fall. The ceremony of the keys takes place each night, as it has for centuries, the gates locked against whatever the darkness might bring. And yet the darkness, according to a long and persistent tradition, brings things of its own. The ghost stories associated with the tower are not a recent invention. They belong to a tradition that stretches back at least as far as the 19th century in its written form, and in some accounts considerably further. The figure most frequently reported by visitors is that of Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, who was found guilty of treason against the king and executed in the courtyard of the Tower on the 19th of May, 1536. She was buried within the tower itself, in the church of St. Peter ad Vincula, which stands inside the inner ward. Her ghost is said to walk near the White Tower carrying her head beneath her arm, and to haunt the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where her remains lie. She is also frequently reported in the courtyard, and is described as the spirit most often encountered by those who visit. The tradition surrounding Henry VI is quieter and more melancholy. He was held at the Tower during the turbulent years of the Wars of the Roses, and he died there, though how he died is a matter of genuine disagreement. Some accounts hold that it was murder, while others suggest it was heartbreak and grief that hastened his end. According to one account, he was probably murdered. Another position holds that accounts differ. Some have argued that he died from heartbreak and melancholy after losing both his crown and his heir, while others maintain that he was murdered by Edward IV in order to clear his path to the throne. Still others hold simply that he was probably murdered, without specifying the cause of death as melancholy. Neither position has been resolved, and the sources do not resolve it. What they agree upon is that his ghost is said to pace the Wakefield Tower and the chapel as midnight approaches on the anniversary of his death, as though replaying a final night that history cannot quite account for. Other figures are said to share the tower's night. Lady Jane Grey, who was briefly proclaimed Queen and was executed on Tower Green on the 12th of February 1554, is counted among the tower's reported ghosts. So is Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, who was herself executed at the Tower. The princes in the Tower, the 2 boys Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York, who were housed within the castle in 1483 and then vanished, presumed murdered, are also named among the presences said to linger there. Guy Fawkes presents a different kind of haunting. He was brought to the Tower on the 6th of November, 1605, following his arrest in connection with the Gunpowder Plot, and he was tortured there into signing a full confession. The torture is believed to have taken place most likely in the area beneath the White Tower. His ghost is not described as a visible apparition. Instead, he is said to be heard, his cries of anguish and his pleas for mercy reported by those who have passed through that part of the castle. It is a haunting composed entirely of sound, which is perhaps fitting for a man whose confession was extracted rather than freely given. There are older, stranger reports as well. In January of 1816, a sentry standing guard outside the jewel house reported an apparition of a bear advancing toward him. The tower had housed a royal menagerie for centuries, and bears had been among its inhabitants, but the menagerie was in decline by this period and would be closed entirely by the early 1830s. The sentry was reported to have died of fright a few days after the encounter. The following year, in October of 1817, a more elaborate account came from the keeper of the crown jewels himself. His name was Edmund Lenthal Swifte, and he reported witnessing a glowing tubular apparition inside the jewel house, which he described as hovering over the shoulder of his wife before she cried out that it had seized her. Both accounts belong to a period when the tower was still very much a working institution, its buildings occupied by staff and their families, its atmosphere shaped not by tourism but by the daily routines of men and women who lived within its walls. The number of executions carried out inside those walls is itself a matter of some dispute. One account puts it at just 7 before the 20th century, while another counts 22 recorded executions in total. Accounts differ on how many people were executed within the tower itself. One holds that only 7 were put to death on Tower Green before the world wars of the 20th century, while another places the total number of recorded executions inside the walls at 22. Either way, far greater numbers met their end on Tower Hill to the north, where executions were more commonly conducted before a public audience. A second account places the total number of recorded executions inside the tower's walls at 22, though other sources put the figure far lower at just 7, suggesting the two counts may not be measuring the same thing. The two figures may count different things, and the sources do not reconcile them. What they agree upon is that the tower was not, in the main, a place of public execution, and that the stories attached to it have grown beyond what the documented record can fully support. This is worth holding in mind as the night deepens over the castle. The tower's reputation as a place of torture and death was shaped substantially by 16th century religious propagandists and by the romanticizing impulse of 19th century writers. The tower never had a permanent torture chamber, despite what popular imagination has long supposed. Torture required authorization from the Privy Council, and between 1540 and 1640, the peak years of imprisonment at the tower, there were 48 recorded cases of its use. The reputation, in other words, exceeds the documented reality, though the documented reality is itself serious enough. And yet the stories persist, and they are not only old stories. More recently, night staff working within the tower have reported apparitions for which no name or history has been supplied. These are not the ghost of Anne Boleyn or the shade of Henry VI. They are formless presences, unnamed terrors noticed at the edge of perception, carrying no narrative and no face. They belong to no particular century. They have not been assigned a biography. They are simply there, or reported to be there, in the hours after the gates have been locked and the visitors have gone, and the yeoman warders have completed the ceremony of the keys, and the castle has settled into the particular quiet that belongs to very old places after dark. It is possible to walk the grounds of the tower today and stand where Anne Boleyn is said to have walked, and where Edmund Lenthal Swifte stood when he described what he saw in 1817, and where the Sentry of 1816 kept his watch outside the jewel house. The stones underfoot are in many cases the same stones, or rest on the same foundations. The White Tower still rises at the centre of the complex, its walls built from the same Kentish ragstone that was quarried and laid in the years after 1066. The church of St. Peter ad Vincula still stands within the inner ward, and Anne Boleyn is still buried there. The Wakefield Tower still marks the corner of the innermost ward along the river where Henry VI is said to pace. The ravens move through the castle grounds by day and are secured at night, as they have been for as long as the tradition has been maintained. The yeoman warders make their rounds. The Thames moves steadily past the southern wall, as it has always moved, indifferent to the accumulation of centuries on the bank above it. Beyond the outer walls, the city goes about its business, lit and noisy and continuous as cities are, but inside the walls, in the hours when the castle is empty of visitors and the night staff move quietly through the corridors and passageways, the tower is what it has always been, a place that holds its history close and releases it slowly, if at all. The hauntings, whether understood as genuine encounters with the past or as the natural consequence of so much history concentrated into so small an area, are part of what the tower is now. They are told by the yeoman warders on their tours, written about in the histories and popular accounts that line the shelves of the gift shop, repeated by visitors who have read them and come hoping, perhaps half hoping, to see something. The tradition is alive and self-renewing, passed from one generation of storytellers to the next, shaped and reshaped by each retelling, and yet somehow retaining the same essential character. The sense that in this particular place the distance between the present and the past is thinner than it is elsewhere, whether that is a property of the place or of the imagination of those who visit it, is not a question the stones will answer. The ceremony of the keys has concluded. The gates are locked. The ravens are at rest. The night watch has begun, as it begins every night, in this very old and very particular darkness, on the north bank of the Thames, at the eastern edge of the city, that William the Conqueror found and made his own. Stone has been quarried, replaced, and repaired across nearly 1,000 years. That, perhaps, is the first thing to say, and the most grounding. The Kentish ragstone laid into the walls of the White Tower in the years after 1066 is still there, beneath the Portland stone facing that replaced the original Caen stone during the 17th and 18th centuries. The foundations rest on the same ground that William the Conqueror chose when he was securing his new and uncertain kingdom, building at the southeastern corner of the old Roman walls where the Thames provided a natural defence from the south. 1,000 years of weather and repair and partial replacement have altered the surface of the place, but they have not removed it. The tower is still, in a meaningful sense, the same structure, and the people who lived and died within it are still, in the records and the stories that have accumulated around those records, attached to it in ways that do not fully dissolve with time. This chapter is not concerned with whether ghosts exist. That question lies outside the scope of what the sources can tell us, and it is not the kind of question that benefits from a verdict delivered in the small hours, when the mind is loose and the boundaries between things are softer than they are in daylight. What the sources can tell us, and what is worth sitting with as the night deepens, is something rather different. That one particular place has gathered, over the course of many centuries, more stories of this kind than almost anywhere else in England, and that those stories have a character, a persistence, and a pattern that are themselves worth understanding, whatever one ultimately concludes about their nature. The tower became associated with the supernatural through a long and layered process, not through a single founding legend. The reputation for haunting grew alongside the reputation for imprisonment and death, and it grew in part because writers and storytellers found the place useful. The 16th century produced the first sustained accounts of the tower as a grim and terrible prison, driven substantially by religious propagandists who wished to characterize the institution in the darkest possible terms. The 19th century added a further layer of romanticization, with writers like William Harrison Ainsworth creating vivid and not always accurate images of underground torture chambers that lodged themselves in the popular imagination and proved very difficult to dislodge. The tower never had a permanent torture chamber, that is stated plainly in the historical record, and yet the image persists because the image had a century and a half of literature and drama behind it before the historical corrective was widely disseminated. The ghost stories belong to this same process of accumulation and embellishment, but they also predate much of the literary romanticization. The accounts of the Sentry in January 1816 and of Edmund Lenthal Swifte in October 1817 were not produced by novelists or propagandists. They were produced by people who worked within the tower, who lived within its buildings, who were embedded in its daily institutional life. Swifte was the keeper of the crown jewels, a position of genuine responsibility, and his account of the glowing tubular apparition that he reported hovering over his wife's shoulder in the jewel house was, by any measure, an unusual thing for a man in his position to place on record. The sentry who reported the bear had no apparent reason to fabricate such an account. The menagerie had been part of the tower for centuries, and bears had indeed been kept there, but the menagerie was in its final decline by 1816 and would be closed entirely within a generation. Whatever prompted the sentry's report, it was not a simple confusion with a living animal. He was reportedly dead of fright within a few days. These two accounts have something in common beyond their location and their approximate period. Both involve people who were not tourists, not visitors, seeking a frisson of historical atmosphere, but residents and employees of a working institution. The tower in the early 19th century was still genuinely occupied in ways that are difficult to imagine today. Families lived within its walls. Staff maintained its buildings and collections. The garrison went about its routines in buildings that had housed soldiers and administrators for hundreds of years. The ghost stories that emerged from this environment were not produced by the tourism industry, because the tourism industry, in the modern sense, had not yet taken hold of the tower. They were produced by people for whom the tower was simply where they worked and, in some cases, where they lived. That distinction matters, though it does not resolve anything. It means that the early accounts cannot be explained away entirely as the product of expectation, of visitors arriving already primed by stories to interpret ambiguous experiences in a particular direction. The Sentry of 1816 and the Keeper of the Crown Jewels in 1817 were not on a ghost tour. They were on duty. The later accounts, including those of nameless and formless apparitions reported more recently by the tower's night staff, belong to a different context. By the time these reports were made, the tower had been a major tourist attraction for well over a century, its ghostly associations thoroughly woven into its public identity, its yeoman warders conducting guided tours that included the famous stories. A night worker in such an environment cannot be fully separated from the stories that surround the place, any more than anyone can fully separate themselves from the cultural context in which they live. And yet the reports persist, and they are made by people whose professional relationship to the tower is, again, one of maintenance and care rather than leisure and curiosity. The named ghosts carry the weight of history behind them in ways that the formless presences do not. Anne Boleyn was executed in the courtyard of the Tower on the 19th of May, 1536, found guilty of treason against the king who had once conducted her personally around the royal apartments in preparation for her coronation. She was buried in the church of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the inner ward, a short distance from where she died. The connection between the place of death and the place of burial, both within the same enclosed complex of walls and towers, gives her haunting a particular quality of confinement. There is nowhere else for her to be, within the logic of the tradition. The tower is where she died, and the tower is where she was buried, and the tower is therefore where she remains. Her ghost is reported near the White Tower, in the courtyard, and in the chapel. She is the figure most often reported by visitors. The tradition has been sustained for long enough that it is now inseparable from the place itself. Henry VI has a different kind of presence. His death is not clearly documented, and the accounts differ in ways that the sources preserve without resolving. One position holds that he was probably murdered. Another holds that some accounts attribute his death to heartbreak and melancholy, to the loss of his crown and his heir, while others maintain that he was killed by Edward IV. The unresolved quality of his historical end may contribute something to the quality of his haunting, which is described not as a dramatic apparition, but as a restless pacing, a figure moving through the Wakefield Tower and the chapel as midnight approaches on the anniversary of his death. It is a haunting without resolution, which matches the history without resolution that underlies it. Guy Fawkes was brought to the Tower on the 6th of November, 1605. He was tortured, most likely in the area beneath the White Tower, and he was eventually broken into signing a confession. His haunting is entirely auditory, not a shape seen in the darkness, but a sound carried through it, cries of anguish and pleas for mercy said to be heard long after his execution. It is the kind of haunting that belongs to a place of suffering rather than a place of death, attached to the act of breaking rather than the act of dying. The Tower records 48 cases of torture during the peak years of imprisonment between 1540 and 1640. Guy Fawkes was one of them. The others, for the most part, did not become ghosts. The reasons for that selectivity are not mysterious. They are the reasons of narrative and memory, which preserve what is famous and let the rest dissolve. But the selectivity is worth noting. The Tower's ghost stories are not a comprehensive account of its suffering. They are the suffering that happened to attach itself to names that survived. Lady Jane Grey was executed on Tower Green on the 12th of February, 1554. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was also executed at the Tower and is counted among its reported ghosts. The princes in the Tower, Edward V, and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, were housed within the castle in 1483 and then disappeared, and are presumed to have been murdered, though by whom and in precisely what circumstances remains, like so much else in the Tower's history, unresolved. These figures form a kind of chorus behind the more frequently cited presences of Anne Boleyn and Henry VI, a company of the named dead whose connection to the Tower is a matter of historical record, and whose ghostly reputations are an extension of that record into the realm of tradition and story. The question of how many people actually died within the Tower's walls is itself uncertain in a way that the sources openly acknowledge. One account holds that only 7 people were executed within the Tower before the world wars of the 20th century, with far greater numbers executed on Tower Hill, where public executions were more commonly carried out. A second account places the total number of recorded executions inside the tower's walls at 22. The two figures may be counting different things, and neither source explains the discrepancy. The point is not to resolve it, but to notice what it tells us about the tower as a historical object. It is a place whose record is genuinely incomplete, whose full accounting of violence and confinement cannot be reconstructed from what has survived. The gaps in the record are real, and they are old. Perhaps that is part of what sustains the tradition. A place whose history is fully known, fully documented, fully accounted for, leaves less room for the imagination to operate. The tower has famous gaps. The princes vanished and were never found, or were found in circumstances that remain ambiguous. Henry VI died, and the manner of his dying was not recorded in a way that settled the question. The bones discovered beneath the White Tower in 1674 could not be definitively identified. The incomplete record is not simply a problem for historians. It is also, in its way, an invitation, a set of open doors through which the tradition has moved freely for centuries, filling what is missing with what can be imagined. The tower today receives millions of visitors. It has been a tourist attraction since at least the Elizabethan period, when foreign visitors wrote about it as one of the sights of London. The ghost stories are now part of the official experience of the place, told on tours, printed in guidebooks, woven into the identity that the tower presents to the world. The yeoman warders include them in their accounts of the castle's history, which is in itself a significant thing. The institution that maintains the tower has absorbed the haunting tradition into its own self-presentation, treating it not as an embarrassment or an irrelevance, but as part of what the tower is. This is not unique to the tower, but it is particularly pronounced there because the tower's history provides such solid ground for the tradition to rest on. The famous ghosts are not invented figures. They are people who genuinely lived and died within these walls, whose biographies are documented, whose executions are on record, whose remains in some cases lie within the precincts of the castle. The tradition does not have to fabricate its subjects. It only has to attach to them the quality of persistence, the suggestion that something of them remained after the execution or the death in custody or the mysterious disappearance, and that this residue can still be encountered under the right conditions by the right people in the right part of the castle at the right hour. The habit of looking is very old. People have been coming to this particular stretch of the north bank of the Thames and attending to what might be seen or heard or felt there for as long as the tower has stood. The earliest tourists wrote about it. The Sentry kept his watch and reported what he saw. Edmund Lenthal Swifte set down his account of the October night in 1817 when the apparition hovered over his wife's shoulder in the jewel house. The night staff, in more recent times, reported the formless presences they encountered in the hours after the gates were locked. Each of these people was paying a kind of attention that the tower seems to invite, an attention sharpened by the knowledge of what happened here and by the particular quality of the silence that settles over old stone buildings in the dark. There is something worth saying about that silence, measured and plain. The tower is a very large and very complex structure, full of passageways and chambers and alcoves, full of the ambient sounds of old buildings settling and the distant sounds of the city beyond the walls. It is also a place saturated with narrative, with the accumulated weight of things that were done here and things that were survived here and things that were not survived. To spend time in it at night, as the night staff do, as the yeoman warders do during the ceremony of the keys, is to spend time in an environment where the imagination has ample material to work with and where the conditions, the darkness, the age of the place,
the knowledge of its history are precisely those most likely to produce the sensation of presence, of something noticed at the edge of perception that does not quite resolve into anything solid or nameable. Whether that sensation corresponds to anything outside the mind of the person experiencing it is not answerable from this distance, or perhaps from any distance. What is answerable, or at least approachable, is the question of why this place, and not another, why the tower has gathered so many of these accounts over so many centuries, and why they continue to be made. The answer that the evidence supports is also the least dramatic one. The tower gathers ghost stories because it gathers history, and because its history is of a particular and concentrated kind. Famous people confined in a small space under conditions of extreme duress over a very long period of time. The confinement is important. The tower is not a battlefield where the violence was diffuse and the victims were many and largely anonymous. It is an enclosure, a place with walls and gates where individual lives were held and in some cases ended in circumstances that were recorded and remembered. The ghosts have names. They have dates attached to them. They have specific locations within the castle, specific buildings in which they are said to be encountered, specific hours at which they are said to appear. The tradition has the quality of biography. It is intimate in scale in a way that battlefield hauntings, for example, rarely are. Anne Boleyn is buried in the church of St. Peter ad Vincula. She has been buried there since 1536. The church still stands, and its walls are the same walls, built in the form that Henry VIII established when he rebuilt it in 1519, refurbished in the 19th century, but not fundamentally altered. To stand in that chapel, and to know that Anne Boleyn is buried beneath it, and was executed a short distance away, is to have an experience that does not require any supernatural belief to be affecting. The place is what it is. The history is what it is. The feeling that something of the past is still present in such a location may be a projection of the imagination, or it may be something that the language of haunting is attempting, however imperfectly, to describe. The Wakefield Tower marks the corner of the innermost ward along the river, where Henry VI is said to walk. Construction of that tower began around 1220, and it has stood on that spot above the same river for 8 centuries. The river beside it has borne witness to nearly 1,000 years of the tower's history, tidal, indifferent, and ever present along its southern wall, carrying on its current long after every soul who once looked out upon it has gone. The city beyond the walls is very different from the city that existed when Henry VI paced those rooms as a prisoner, or when Guy Fawkes was conducted through the gates in November 1605, or when Edmund Lenthal Swifte watched the strange light move through the air of the Jewel House on an October night in 1817. The city has grown enormously, has rebuilt itself many times, has changed in almost every particular. But the tower remains, and the river remains, and the stones laid in the years after 1066 remain beneath the later surfaces. The habit of looking continues. It continues in the accounts given by night staff, in the tours conducted by the yeoman warders, in the stories told and retold, in the books that accumulate around this place, and in the voices that describe it to listeners who are by now somewhere between wakefulness and sleep. The tower does not require belief in order to be remarkable. It only requires attention, the kind of attention that very old places, saturated with documented suffering and genuine historical weight, have always seemed to invite from the people who come to them in the dark, or who lie still and let the darkness come to them and listen. The gates are locked, as they are every night, at the conclusion of the ceremony of the keys. The ravens are settled, as they are required by tradition to remain
at least 6 of them, within the walls of the castle. The yeoman warders have completed their rounds. The Thames moves south of the outer wall, steady and dark and continuous, carrying the city's reflection in pieces on its surface. The White Tower rises at the centre of the complex, as it has risen for close to 1,000 years, its ragstone walls holding the particular quality of stillness that belongs to very thick and very old stone in the hours before dawn. Nothing is resolved here. The manner of Henry VI's death remains disputed. The fate of the princes in the tower remains unknown. The number of those who died within these walls is recorded differently by different sources and will not be reconciled tonight. The apparition that Edmund Lenthal Swifte described in 1817 was not explained, and the sentry who died a few days after his encounter in January 1816 left no further account of what he had seen. What remains is the stone and the river and the long habit of attending to both. What remains is the accumulation of centuries in a small and bounded space, the sense that history in this particular place has not dispersed into the general air of the past, but has stayed close to the walls where it was made. What remains, finally, is the tradition itself. The stories passed from the night staff to the yeoman warders, to the guidebooks, to the tours, to the listeners who come, in whatever form and from whatever distance, to sit with the Tower of London and let it be what it is, a very old place, a documented place, a place where real people lived and suffered and died, and where the record of their living and suffering and dying is still, in the most literal sense, housed within the same walls that housed them. The rest is silence and time and the river and the dark.